Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Drawing Down the Dragon. I'm Snappy, and thank you for joining me for today for our reading of Malpertuis by Jean Ray. So I'm really excited about this one, guys. So a while back, for my morning adorations or my evening adorations, I discovered this author, Jean Ray, who's a Belgian French author who's born in the late 1800s, died around 1964, and I'd never heard of him before, but he came up as widely cited as one of the grandfathers, so to speak, of modern horror and sort of cosmic mystical weirdness. And so I decided to check out a bunch of their short stories. And some of you may remember we read on the channel one of his most famous shorts, which was, God, what was it called now? I had it here. Where is it? So bad with names. The main Salter, which was all about this mysterious ship and this kraken underworld undersea spirit. Really, really, really wild, wild stuff. And yeah, I'm glad you guys like the sweater. I'm not sure what a Coogie is, but yeah, I don't know. I got it as a gift, and it's my colors, so we love it. But Jean Ray is an amazing, incredible writer, and I was blown away by his shorts. And when I was diving into more of his work, I came across this mysterious piece, Malpertuis. And what really intrigued me about Malpertuis is when I started to read about when I started to read summaries of it, they would reference the Greek gods. Now, I'm not going to bring it up because I think it's a bit of a spoiler, but it was enough for me to hook me to want to read this particular story. But I'll give you a little bit of the basic premise here. Uh, the idea is that we have this guy, Jean Jacques Renault, or Jean Jacques. Anyway, we have our main character, our main antagonist, and they get called back to the deathbed of their grandfather, or sorry, of their great uncle Kassav. And this guy is sort of like a sea captain and a billionaire and a sorcerer. And he has this wild labyrinth of a mansion called Malpertuis. And he invites all of his extended family to come stay at Malpertuis as one of the prerequisites in order to get any of his money. So he's this billionaire guy, right, with this sprawling mansion, this mysterious sorcerer figure on his deathbed, and he's forcing all of his family to stay in this weird, magical, mysterious, haunted house. So that's the premise. Very classic. All of these greedy people only there to get a piece of the remains of Kassav. So we're going to dive in here and have some fun today. I just wanted to take it easy and read for you guys a beautiful story here on Saturday. So I hope you will indulge me and have some fun. All right. Oh, and before we do dive in, let's give a shout out here to the chat. So much love to Marion the Barbarian. Much love, Hannah. Much love, Hupomeno. Leslie, much love. Howard, much love. Astro, much love. The Phoenix, much love. All right. But yeah, you guys are really going to like this one. You know, it really has, on the surface, it's not going to appear like it has much to do with Hellenism, but believe me, Jean Ray is a dragon, one of the most extraordinary magical texts I've ever read. So prepare yourselves because this is about to get truly effing wild. I can't recommend this book enough. Okay, so let's have some fun. Here we go. Malpertuis. Oh, actually, before we dive into Malpertuis, I wanted to show you guys in the 70s, in 1971 or 72, they made a movie for Malpertuis, which looks pretty wild. And it starred Orson Welles as Kassav, the sorcerer. So let's take a look at this trailer first so that we have a little bit of an understanding. Okay. Uh, it's just so beautiful, too. I love the aesthetics here.
Je bent hier. Dat is het belangrijkste. Eindelijk kan ik sterven. Zeer gauw, jongen, ben je meester hier. Malpertuis wordt wie van een nieuwe wereld.
Zeg mij wat er hier aan de hand is.
Ik mag je niet zeggen.
Ik ga wel alleen op zoek naar het geheim van Malpertuis.
En God weet, wat zul je vinden? Wat zul je vinden?
Amour, 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 toujours. Amour, 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 toujours.
Je weet niet wat ik zo even zag. Vader, het baat niets. Je kunt niet ontsnappen uit Malpertuis.
Isn't that wild? Isn't that wild? Look at the aesthetics of that film. Just gorgeous, right? Wild. So for fun, what we're going to do is at the end of the evening tonight, after Searching for Dragons, which is a show I'm doing at 8 p.m. Eastern with my dear friend Graham. But later on this evening, after that show, we're going to do a special in the Temple of the Muses Discord where we're going to watch Malpertuis. So if you people want to come and hang out with us and watch some art house horror from the 70s from Belgium, then come check it out. So this is like a French house of 1,000 corpses. Oh, that's not a terrible comparison. This is a lot stranger, less violent, a lot more strange. You guys are gonna love. I'm like, honestly, I cannot recommend this book enough. We're gonna have some fun. So let's dive in, guys. Enough waiting. Let's dive in. Malpertuis. Okay, here we go. So we first have an introduction here. An inventory by way of preface and explanation. The job on the Monastery of the White Fathers was definitely worth the trouble. I could, had I so wished, have made a clean sweep of any amount of valuables, but although lacking in devoutness, I am not an unbeliever in the very idea of making away with devotional objects, even though they be weighty objects of gold and silver, fills me with horror. The good monks will be weeping over the loss of their palimpsests, their incunabula, and their antiphonaries. But they praise the Lord for his having turned away an impious hand from the Ciboria and their monstrances. My impression was that the weighty pewter tube I found concealed in the monastery must contain some valuable manuscripts for which an unscrupulous collector might give me a tidy sum. But all I found therein was this crabbled scrawl, the laborious decipherment of which I put off until a later date. The leisure this called for came to me when the proceeds of my expedition transformed me into a comfortable citizen of tranquil and orderly aspirations. It takes money to turn a ruffian into an honest man, obedient to the law. As regards myself, I feel obliged to provide certain explanations. They will be brief, for my part in this story calls for some discretion. My family had intended me for the teaching profession. I had obtained a place at the École Normale, where I was an apt pupil. I greatly regret not being able to make anything of the philological thesis that won me the congratulations of the examiners, but it explains the interest I took in my discovery and the obstinacy I brought to the solution of a problem for which the data were appallingly obscure. If I was recompensed in a most fantastic fashion, that surely is no fault of mine. When I had emptied the pewter tube and saw my table strewn with yellowing scribbled papers, it needed a return to the patience and Benedictine curiosity of my youth to set me to my task. At first, this was no more than an inventory. As a matter of fact, all those sheets of paper would, if they had been gathered together and submitted to a publisher, have constituted a work of colossal size and minimal interest. So encumbered were they with useless digressions, extraordinary observations, and such a display of dubious speculation. It was up to me to sift, to classify, to eliminate. 4 hands, trembling, fevered, if not 5, have participated in the putting together of this narrative of mystery and terror. The first was that of an adventurer of genius who was also a man of the church, for he wore a priest's garb. I shall call him Dusdam, the elder, to distinguish him from one of the descendants of the same name, who likewise wore the cloth, the Abbé Dusdam. The latter was a saintly priest and worthy of veneration. He too collaborated in the annals relating the history of Malpertuis. He was, in a sense, the torchbearer of truth in that haunted darkness. Thus, Rustam the Elder is the first of the 4 or 5 authors of the account, and the younger Dustam is the third. According to my calculations, the adventure of Dustam the Elder took place in the first quarter of the previous century. The light thrown on the affair by his grandson seems to have been lit in the beginning of the last quarter. A young man of excellent education and, in my opinion, of highly cultivated tastes, but marked with the brand of misfortune, is the second author of the narrative. It is to him that we are indebted for the kernel of the story. It is about him that the whole story gravitates in tumultuous and fearsome orbits. Reading the first pages in his hand, I thought this was a journal like those kept in the last century by young persons fired by a reading of Sterne's Sentimental Journey. I was undeceived as slowly my work progressed. I discovered then that he had committed his thoughts to paper only when in distress, when faced with an imminent farewell to life. A little notebook in a neat, scholarly hand was also in the metal sheath, bringing the number of collaborators to 4. This was in the hand of Dom Misserand, the deceased abbot of the monastery of the White Fathers, in which I had carried out the profitable excursion that led me to the discovery of the pewter tube. At the end of the notebook, a date was written. It was, as it were, a fixed point, rigidly immobile, in the headlong flight of time, the 26th of September, 1898. Filthy. And finally, I'm obliged to add my own name to the roll of those scribes who, without their knowledge, or almost without it, have given Malpertuis a place in the history of human terror. At the head of this narrative, I place a brief chapter whose author, even though he does not speak in the first person, is undoubtedly Dustam the Elder. The identity of the handwriting with that of other lines known to have been written by that man of profound learning, but somberly malign disposition, convinces me of this. As I see it, the renegade priest had decided to write a true adventure story, presented in an objective fashion, in which his own person would not be spared any more than those of the rest, in which indeed, on the contrary, it would be his cynical pleasure to besmear himself with shady villainies. But the disorder of his life led him, no doubt, to give up his ambition to be a scribbler, and he was content to leave a few lines, which are none the less of great interest in the history of Malpertuis. I have retained the title he gave to that beginning of a story, which I reproduce here, just as it stands. Part 1, Electa. Opening, the vision of Anacharsis. So, for those of you who don't know, Anacharsis is one of the 7 great philosophers of the pre-Socratic era of ancient Greece. He's a Scythian and most famous for the creation of the trope, the noble savage, because he often would appear in fables about him for years and years after, right? So we're dealing with some real wild Greek magic here, okay? The narrator, their main narrator, who's discovering all these texts, is someone who is studied in Greek and is reading this from Greek language that was hidden inside of these tubes in an ancient monastery, right? And now they're referencing at the opening of our story, Anacharsis, right? Yeah, one of the seven wise men, right, Gandhi? It's not everything is stolen, right? Everything is stolen. Anyway, let's dive into this beautiful work. You guys are going to love this. Okay. It is in vain that you build churches, stake out the roads with chapels and crosses. You will not prevent the gods of ancient Thessaly from returning in the songs of poets and the books of scholars. Hawthorne. The fog broke in the island, whose presence the fury of the breakers had already announced from afar, seemed so terrifying that the mariner, Anacharsis, clinging to the wheel, began to cry out in alarm. For many hours his tartan, the Fenna, had been heading for disaster, drawn by the deadly lodestone of that monstrous rock, battered by the high and livid waves and crowned by the lightning's flamboyant rage. Anacharsis cried out, for he was afraid of the death he had seen about him since dawn. The fall of the lateen yard had killed his pilot, Morales, and when the little boat took a list to starboard, and the water they had taken aboard flowed back, he had seen the corpse of the cabin boy, Estupulus, his head caught in a scupper. The Fenna had not been responding to her rudder since the evening before, and the skipper's navigation was purely instinctive. He realized that he had completely lost his bearings, as much by drifting as by the contrary winds and unknown tides. He had no recollection of ever having seen this island, although the seas thereabouts had for many years been familiar to him. The horrible stench of anagris, the thrice accursed plant, came to him from that mortal land. Already so close at hand, he knew that impure spirits were involved in his adventure. Of this he was quite certain when he saw forms floating over the summits of the rock. In their shapes and attitudes, they were repulsively human, and for the most part, they were gigantic beyond comparison. They gave the impression of being different sexes, to judge by the strength of some and the relative beauty of others. Their dimensions, too, differed among themselves. Some approached the normal in size, others seemed dwarfed and deformed. But it may be that distance played a part in these discrepancies of vision. Immobile, every one, they were staring fixedly into the tormented sky, frozen in a horrible despair. Corpses, he sobbed, corpses the size of mountains. And in terror he turned his gaze away from one of them which, in its formidable immobility, remained tinged with an indescribable majesty. Another did not float, but was as one with the rock. It was distorted with agony and inhuman suffering. Its flank gaped open like a cavern, and it alone seemed to have preserved some dreadful shudderings of life and motion. A shadow was hovering over it, but since it was obscured from time to time by wisps of fog, the mariner was unable to assign to it a distinct identity. For all that he would have sworn it was an enormous bird, it rose and fell at the rough wind's pleasure. Nevertheless, it was plain that it was watching with a ferocious avidity over the captive form of the rock. At one moment, it even fell from on high onto its phantasmal prey and cruelly tore at it with claws and beak. A whirlwind caught the tartane, set it twisting like a spinning top, and hurled it beyond the breakers. The jiggermast and the bowsprit were ripped away, and the cabin boy's body swept overboard. A spar fell on Anacharsis, striking him on the back of the neck. For a time, he lost all awareness. And when he regained his senses, he was no longer at the wheel, but clinging to a stump of the mast. He could no longer see the island nor the hideous floating forms, but a ferocious figure hung over him. Face to face with those cruel eyes and curled up lips, he cried out again. But an instant later, he was aware that he had nothing to fear from them, for they belonged to a figurehead horribly ugly to be sure, but lacking any murderous intention. The figure surmounted a high, sharp prow, looming athwartships over the larboard side. A second later, the Fenna was rammed with a shattering blow and went under. But somebody on the colliding ship had seen the mariner, and a carefully manipulated grapnel delivered him from the perils of the sea. Anacharsis was in pain, in terrible pain. His ribs were broken, and his sides hurt him dreadfully. His hair and his beard were sopping with blood, but he smiled to find himself stretched out on a sailor's bunk in a narrow cabin, lit by a lamp fixed to the compass mounting. There were men standing about, looking at him and talking among themselves. One of them, an enormous mulatto, was scratching his vigorous black shock of hair with an expression of puzzlement. Devil take me, he bellowed, if I thought I'd run into a little tub like that in these waters. What'd you make of it? The person to whom he addressed his query seemed no less surprised. Better ask the fellow, he growled. But then, like as not, he'll talk some gibberish we don't understand. Better call in that blackguard, Deuce Dame. He's a scholar. And if he isn't soused out of his mind, he'll make something out of it. Anar- Anar- Anacharsis saw a grossly fat creature bearing down on him, a man with a furfurcacious visage and malicious squinting eyes, who, by way of greeting, stuck out his tongue. He spoke to him in his own language, that of the islanders of the archipelago. What are you up to in these parts? Anacharsis was hard pressed to collect his thoughts, much less to speak. It was as if a mountain were bearing down on his chest. To oblige his rescuers, though, he mastered his pain. After a fashion, he told his tale, his losing his way, the terrible storm that had wrecked the Fenna, far from familiar waters. Tell me your name, the man called Deuce Dame demanded. Anacharsis, eh? What's that you said? Tell me again, the fat man exclaimed. Anacharsis! That's what my father was called, and it's my name too. God Almighty, the fat man said, turning to his companions. What's this What's this got to do with us, Deuce Dame? One of them asked. If that isn't a case of predestination, I'm a monkey's uncle. Explain yourself, gutbag, the mulatto commanded. Patience, Monsieur Anselme, the portly one replied with a respect touched with irony. I must have recourse to my memory and my knowledge. The hell with the two of them, you gallows birds of a schoolmaster, Monsieur Anselme intoned. Anacharsis, Deuce Dame explained, bowing to an invisible interlocutor, is the name of the Scythian philosopher who, having sailed among the islands of Attica, came to Athens in the 6th century before Christ, where he sought to introduce the worship of Demeter along with that of Pluto. It cost him dear, for it is never prudent to involve oneself in religious matters. They strangled him. The skipper of the Faina, who understood nothing of this blather and who felt his strength slipping away, interrupted him to speak of the terrible forms he had glimpsed among the mists swirling about the island. Forthwith, Deuce Dame began shouting and gesticulating. We're there, he chuckled. I guarantee you a cargo of gold, my friends. Anacharsis, the representative of the gods, is doomed, down to the last of his descendants, to achieve his mission. Ah, centuries and millennia are as nothing to phantoms. Monsieur Anselme had grown serious. Have him tell us the course he was on at the end, he said. Due south, the wounded man said when Deuce Dame had translated. And what are we to do now? We can't burden ourselves with useless passengers, Monsieur Anselme announced firmly. The fat Deuce Dame exploded with laughter. It is written that the line of Anacharsis meet their end by strangulation. Anacharsis understood nothing of this talk, but he read his fate in the inexorable expressions of those to whom he was indebted for an hour of existence. He murmured a prayer, one he did not complete in this life. Before submitting to the reader the continuation of Deuce Dame, the elder's account, I shall insert here the narrative of Jean Jacques' grandsire. As I have already pointed out, this narrative constitutes the kernel of the story. It is, in short, around the appalling destiny of Jean Jacques' grandsire that the whole horror of Malpertuis revolves. So, how wild is that? Now you guys understand what we're getting ourselves into. Anacharsis, taken outside of time and brought into the present time of the story. Okay? Things are about to get wild and magical. So let's see. Uncle Kassav passes on. The man who enters upon the mystery of death, leaving to the living the mystery of his life, has at the same time cheated both life and death. Stefano Zanowick. Uncle Kassav is dying, white and quivering. His beard flows from his leaden face over the red eiderdown. He breathes the air as if he were inhaling utterly delectable odors, and his hands, which are large and hairy, claw at anything that comes within their reach. The Griboin woman, who came to bring him his tea with leaven, said, "He's packing his little bags." Uncle Kassav had heard her. "Not yet, woman, not yet," he laughed humorously. When she's gone, in an eddy of frightened petticoats, he turned and spoke to me. "I haven't got all that long left now, my boy. But then again, dying's a serious business, so one shouldn't be in a rush about it." Then once more his gaze began to wander about the room, lingering on each object as if for a final inventory. One after another it rests on an imitation bronze theorbo player, a minuscule, hazy Adrian Brewer, a cheap engraving representing an old woman, and a very valuable Amphitrite by Mabuse. There is a knock at the door, and Uncle Didaloo enters. "Good day, great uncle," he says. He is the one member of our family to call Uncle Kassav great uncle. Didaloo is a civil servant and a meticulous man. He had started out as a teacher, but his pupils used to persecute him. Now he is a deputy chief clerk in the local administration, and for the copy clerks working under his orders, a worse tyrant is not to be found. "Charles," Uncle Kassav says, "talk to me, make a speech." "Certainly, great uncle, but I'm worried that might tire you. In that case, admire me in silence, but look sharp about it. I don't much like the look of you." Old Kassav is turning nasty. "I'm sorry to have to say it," Uncle Didaloo sighs, "but I have to talk to you about wretched materialistic questions, great uncle. We need money. Really? That's surprising. We have to pay the doctor. Some buckus? Oh, come now. You give him his food and his drink, and you let him sleep on the sofa in the drawing room if need be. He won't ask for more than that. The apothecary. I never finish any of his bottles, and I never touch his powders. The fact is that your wife, charming Sylvie, who suffers from every ailment in the medical dictionary, makes off with the lot. There are many other things as well, great uncle. Where are we to find the money? In the third cellar, under the seventh flagstone, 9 feet 4 inches down, there is a strong box filled with gold. Will that do? What a man! Uncle Didaloo whimpers. I'm truly sorry I can't say the name of say the same thing of yourself, Didaloo. I'm truly sorry I can't say the same thing of yourself, Didaloo. And now be off with you, eh, fathead? Charles Didaloo casts me a menacing look and sneaks out of the room, so small and thin that he barely has to open the door. I am seated in a tasseled and thickly upholstered armchair, my face turned toward the bed. Uncle Gustave returns my gaze. I turn a little more into the light Jean Jacques. I obey. The dying man stares at me with painfully close attention. There's no denying it, he murmurs after a prolonged examination. You're a grandsire, despite the loss of character in your features. It only needed a touch of softness in the blood to mellow the harshness of your ancestors. Damn it, though, your grandfather, Anselm, grandsire, Monsieur Anselm, as they called him in days gone by, was no end of a rogue. Coming from Uncle Coming from Uncle Kassav, the insult was a familiar one, and I thought no worse of him on that account, for I had never known my ill-famed grandfather. If he hadn't died of beriberi on the Guinea coast, he'd have become an even greater rogue. Uncle Kassav continues, laughing. He was a man who loved perfection in all things. The door opens wide, and my sister Nancy appears. Her dress is skin tight, emphasizing her splendid curves. Her deeply scalloped corsage leaves no doubt as to the richness of her flesh. Her face, dark and flushed, gives evidence to her anger. You sent Uncle Charles packing, she says. That's all well and good. Let him look after his own affairs, but he was right. We need money. You and he, Uncle Kassav replies, are two entirely different things. Good. So where is it then? Nancy frets. The Graboynes haven't any more, and the tradesmen are sending in their bills. All you have to do is take it from the shop. Nancy laughs, a strident little laugh that goes well with her haughty style of beauty. Since 7 this morning, we've had 6 customers, a total of 42 sous. And they say business is looking up, the old man chuckles. But don't trouble yourself about that, my lovely. Go back to the shop. Take the little step ladder with 7 steps and climb up to the 7th. Don't do it when there's a customer in the shop, though you wear your skirts very short. Being the height you are, perched on the 7th step, you'll be able to reach the tin box marked raw sienna. Shove your pretty white hands into that uninviting powder, my sweet, and you'll find 4 or 5 rolls that are heavy for their size. Wait a moment now. Don't be in such a hurry. I like having you here. If the sienna gets under your fingernails, it'll take you hours before you're rid of it. Right you are then. Off you go, my beauty. And if Matthias Crook pinches your backside on the stairs where it's dark, there's no use shouting out. I won't be coming. Nancy sticks out her tongue, red and pointed as a flame, and leaves, banging the door behind her. For a few moments we hear her heels rat-a-tat-tatting on the sonorous treads of the staircase. Then her voice, loud and furious. Pig! Uncle Kassav laughs. That's not Matthias, he says. A slap echoes. It's Uncle Charles. The old man is fine fettle, and were it not for his leaden color and the labored bellows sound of his breathing, I would never think him to be dying. She at least is worthy of a rogue of a grandfather, he declares with evident satisfaction. Silence falls again in the room. The bellows are animating an invisible brazier. The hands claw at the sheets with a sound like that of a file. Jean-Jacques? Uncle Kassav? Did you get news this morning, Nancy and yourself, of your father, Nicholas Grandsire? Yesterday morning, uncle. Good, good. The days don't mean very much to me. Where did it come from, that letter? Singapore. Daddy is doing well. Always supposing he hasn't been hanged in the 12 weeks the letter took in coming. God help us, if he were ever to come back. He reflects, his head bent over one shoulder like a strange carrion crow. He'll never be back. Why should he, after all? The grandsires were born to sail the high seas under all the world's winds, not to go moldy under a roof. The door opens. Nancy has returned, smiling, her ill humor gone. I found 5 rolls, Uncle Kassav, she says. Heavy stuff, gold, eh? Uncle Kassav sniggers. I suppose you know what to do with it? Don't I just know? Nancy replies pertly. She leaves us, and as she shuts the door, she calls out to me, Gigi, Elodie's waiting for you in the kitchen. We hear her on the stairs, laughing softly and clucking like a hen. This time it's Matthias, Uncle says. He laughs heartily, even though this unleashes a tempest of rattling in the depths of his chest. 5 rolls, she said, eh? There were 6 of them. Aha, she's a splendid little granddaughter for that ruffian of an Anselm grandsire. I'm really pleased. These visits, his pleasure and his talking have visibly tired him. Go and see Elodie, my boy, he says in a voice that has suddenly grown weary and remote. I'm more than happy to do so. From the depths of the huge and Stygian clearage, where there is a vast kitchen the size of a lecture hall, rises the warm smell of waffles and the fine scent of melted butter augmented with sugar and cinnamon. I traverse an enormously long corridor at the end of which is a square of feeble light. At the far end of a vestibule bathed in the shifting glow of gaslight, one could see a shop, distant and unreal, as if seen from the wrong end of a spyglass. The story of that shop, tacked onto a rich and powerful master mariner's house, is a strange one, but I shall soon enough have occasion to return to it. I see a high wooded counter, tall carboys, bunches of paper bags, and the silhouettes of Nancy and the assistant Matthias close to each other, perhaps too close. But for me, the spectacle is of little interest. The urgent call of the kitchen is much more imperious than that of idle adolescent curiosity. The song of the cooking butter and the clatter of the waffle irons imposes their joyful note on the evening's calm twilight. It was high time you came, our old servant Elodie cries. The doctor was just going to eat your share. They're very good, a small voice chortles from the shadows. Well sugared, the way I like them. There is no gaslight in the kitchen. Uncle Kassav had reserved that one luxury for the shop. A broad wicked lamp casts a penurious light on the table and the whiteness of the plates. A candle on the mantel shelf, guttering in the hot blast of the stove, illuminates the heavy black waffle iron. How's the patient doing? The small voice continues. Very nicely, eh? Is he going to get well, doctor? Get well? Whoever told you such a thing? No, no, Kassav is well and truly condemned by the faculty. That doesn't prevent me, though, from doing something for him. In the lamplight, a decrepit hand, wax pale, brandishes a sheet of paper. Here's the death certificate and the authorization for burial ad hoc, drawn up and duly signed by myself. I've left only the date blank. Yesterday, it still had double pneumonia as the cause of death, but I've given the matter some thought, and it seems to me Bright's disease would be more distinguished. I owe that much to old Kassav, don't you think? And now, Elodie, I'd very much like another of those excellent waffles. Thus speaks Dr. Sambucus, who visits Uncle whose visits Uncle accepts and whose prescriptions he refuses. He is so small, so puny that even with his hat on his head, he barely reaches up to Elodie's nose, and she was of no great height. His face is a mass of wrinkles and scars, except for his nose, which juts out from that rumpled miniature like a pink, fleshy headland. The waxed hand takes on an extraordinary firmness as it cuts the waffle into regular squares before saturating them with butter and syrup. I believe I'm the older of the two of us, although one can't say anything at all precise about the dear men. But I think he'll be the first to go. The greedy old man cackles cheerfully. That's a consolation to a man of my age, for it seems to me that death is forgetting us. Who knows? Perhaps that's how it is. It's 40 years now since Kassav and I became close friends. I made his acquaintance on a ferry boat. He'd been hunting and he'd shot a brace of godwit. I congratulated him because they're splendid birds and difficult to shoot. He invited me to share them with him. I took good care not to refuse his offer. A fine fat godwit is even tastier than its relative, the woodcock. Since then, I have had free access to Malpertuis. Malpertuis. For the first time, the name had flowed in a turbid ink from my terrified pen. That house, placed by the most terrible of wills like a full stop at the end of so many human destinies. I still thrust aside its image. I recoil, I procrastinate, rather than bring it to the forefront of my memory. What is more, pressed no doubt by the brevity of their earthly term, human beings are less patient than the house. Things remain after them, things like the stones of which accursed dwellings are made. Human beings are animated by the feverish haste of sleep, tumblings through abattoir gates. They will not rest until they have taken their place under the great candle snuffer that is Malpertuis. Nancy swans into the kitchen. She preferred crepes to waffles and would tear them between her cruel teeth like scraps of burning skin. Dr. Sambucus, she inquires, when will Uncle Kassav die? You must know. Flower of my dreams, the old doctor replies. Are you addressing Asclepius or Tiresias, the healer, or the soothsayer? It doesn't much matter provided he knows. Sambucus picks and plucks at the air with his waxen fingers. He calls this operation taking his bearings by the celestial planisphere. The pole star is in a place, as always. That's the only one attuned with the infinite. Aldebaran is rising to larboard, under the Pleiades. Saturn is prowling the horizon. He poisons with his luminous cyanide. Half a turn. The south is more communicative than the north today. Pegasus has a whiff of the stable of old Helicon. Cygnus is singing as if her ascent to the zenith is going to be the death of her. The eagle, the fires of Altair, in his eyes is winging the airs closest to the god of space. Aquarius is up to no good, and Capricorn. That's enough, my sister breaks in impatiently. As always, you know nothing. In my days, the doctor continues abruptly, changing the subject, they used to scent waffles with eau de naf. The gods themselves never knew a more delicious treat. Ah, yes, my rose, you're asking about the excellent Kassav. He has another week to go at least, if not two, before he casts his soul loose among the stars. Ass, my sister says. 3 days will be enough. My sister was right. Graboyne woman pokes her head into the kitchen. Mamselle Nancy, the Misses Cormelin are here. Put them in the yellow drawing room. But Mamselle, there's no fire. Exactly, that's why. There's Madame Sylvie, too, and her daughter come to fetch Monsieur Charles. The yellow drawing room. At that point, I rebel. But Uriel is with Aunt Sylvie. What about it? Uriel doesn't bother herself in the slightest, burning hot or freezing, storm or flat calm. I suppose cousin Filarete is there at least. He's with us in our kitchen, Mamselle Nancy. He's drinking Calvados with Graboyne. He says he's got a cold on his stomach. Did he finish the job for Uncle Kassav? If he didn't, show him the door. The stuffed mouse? Oh, yes, Mamselle. He's brought it along with him, and he's made a good job of it. Dr. Sambucus breaks into a low, gurgling, and protracted laugh. That'll be the brave Kassav's last hunting piece. A mouse it was that ran over the eider down. He throttled it neatly between his thumb and his forefinger. 40 years ago, he was still shooting godwits. Everyone into the yellow drawing room, Nancy commands. I've got something to say to those people. Shabby and down at heel, the Graboyne woman slips away. Me too, the little doctor asks warily. Yes, finish your waffle. In that case, I'll grab a cup of coffee with some rum in it and plenty of sugar. At my age, a session in the yellow drawing room is like taking a siesta on a glacier, Sambucus grumbles. Of all the sinister and icy rooms that go to make up the interior of Malpertuis, the yellow drawing room is the most sinister and icy. The 2 7-branched candelabra that light it do so poorly enough, but I am certain that Nancy will have lit no more than 3 or 4 wicks. The company who assemble there seat themselves on high, straight-backed chairs in distinct shadows, whose voices fall flat like a clamor lost in a desert. And every word they say is lugubrious, ill-intentioned, or despairing. Nancy makes off with the broad-wick lamp, for at this hour the corridors are thick with darkness. She sets it down several meters from the door on the pedestal of a statue of the boundary god. She has no intention of providing any extra illumination for all these people she detests. I'll leave you the candle, Elodie. That'll be enough for me to say my rosary by. The assembly in the yellow drawing room is exactly as I expected, made up of dark and indistinct shadows, installed in the one low chair in the form of a prayer stool. It takes me a bit of time to recognize them. Veiled in perpetual mourning, the Cormelin sisters occupy a sofa upholstered in black rep. They look like 3 praying mantises lying in wait for some nocturnal insect to come within their range. They don't greet anyone, stiff and motionless, but I feel their eyes fixed with cold fury on our entrance. From the open door, cousin Filarete uncouth looking and badly dressed, cries out, "Hello, everybody. Would you like to see my mouse?" He holds aloft the small board. To it is glued a gray and pink form. I'd have liked to have mounted it sitting up like a squirrel, but it wouldn't come right that way. Didn't even look pretty. He speaks with the coarse joviality of the uneducated. The Didaloo family sit in a zone of light about the candlestick. Uncle Charles stares stubbornly at his brightly polished boots. Aunt Sylvie, commonplace, neuter, graying, grins at us, slack-lipped, and at her least movement, the jet-bejeweled breastplate of her corsage judders and creaks. I have eyes only for their daughter, my cousin Uriel, dressed with a nun-like modesty, but with her amazing mass of chestnut red hair that seems sprinkled with shifting stars, and her eyes of jade. She keeps her eyes closed, and I regret that. I should have liked to have played with them, as one plays with gems, rolling them between one's fingers, awakening their latent green flames, breathing life into them. Suddenly, a shrewish voice arises. "We want to see Uncle Kassav." It is Eleanor, the eldest of the Cormellan sisters. "You'll all see him in 3 days, and for the last time. He will have something to say to you. The notary scamp will be present, and his father Isengott too, as a witness. That is what Uncle Kassav wants." Nancy has spoken without pausing for breath. Now she falls silent, staring at the candle flames. "It'll be for the will, I suppose?" Eleanor Cormellan asks. Nancy makes no reply. "I dearly have loved to have seen him," says cousin Filarete. "He'd surely have complimented me on my mouse. But what he wants is what he wants, and it's not up to me to question it. Now that we're all together," Uncle Charles begins. "We? Don't speak of us as a whole or something that's connected," my sister retorts. "And supposing we are all together, it isn't to talk to you. Now that you know what you have to know, you might as well be on your way." "Do you realize, mademoiselle, that it's taken us more than half an hour to get here?" cries Rosalie, the second of the sisters. "As far as I'm concerned," Nancy replies, with an ill-conceived fury, "you could have come here from the other side of the globe, and you could go back there." A look of uneasy attention comes abruptly over the faces of all those present, except Uriel's. Heavy footsteps sound howlily on the tiled floor of the hallway. Then the door opens, creaking on its hinges. "Where does he hide?" comes a plaintive voice, the one who's always putting out the lamps. "My God, the lamps are going out again?" Aunt Sylvie wails. "There was a lamp by the boundary god, and just as I was going toward it, it was such a cheerful sight. He blew it out." "Who is it then?" implores Aunt Didaloo. "Who knows? I've never set out to see him because I know he's black and terrible. He puts out all the lamps. The pink and the green one that lights the stairs up in such pretty colors was burning on the landing. A hand pinched the wick, and night flowed down the staircase like the waters of hell. I've been looking for him these 5 years, 10 years, maybe all my life, but I never find him. Did I say I want to? No, no. I don't think I want to at all. But he's always putting the lamps out. He blows them out or pinches the flame to death. A strange man has just entered. He is immensely tall, horrifyingly thin. If he had not been bent, he would be well over 6 feet in height. A reddish greatcoat floats about this skeletal creature. His features are obscured in a repulsive, coarse mop of hair. He draws close to the candles, ravished with the light. Aha! He doesn't put these out, not these ones. It's good to see the light. For me, it's food and drink. "Lapernice, Tenebrio, what are you doing here?" Dr. Sambucus calls out. "He has every right to be here," Nancy riposts. "He'll be at the coming assembly. There'll be candles alight and lamps," the old monster exults. "A light burns in my shop as beautiful as the day, but I cannot return there. Such is the decree of the forces." Lampernice, Uncle Didaloo begins, barely repressing a shudder of fear or of disgust. "Lampernice, it's my name. Lampernice. Colors and varnishes. That's what it said above the door in beautiful letters in three shades. I sold every sort of color, every sort. Fumigating, candles, drying oil, shale oil, gray and white mastic, ochre, zinc, white, and lead white, thick and creamy, clear varnish and brown varnish, French chalk and corrosive acids. My name's Lampernice, and I enjoy colors. Now they've put me in the darkness. There was a time I sold animal black and lamp black, but I never gave anyone the darkness of night. I am Lampernice. I'm good, and they've cast me into the depths of the night with someone who always puts out the lamps. Now the monster is laughing and weeping at the same time. He holds out his spider like hands to the candle flame. They burn his fingernails, but he pays no heed and continues to give rein to his pathetic joy. I have no fear of Lampernice, who lives somewhere in the house. Somewhere they're hardly likely to look for him. The Graboynes limit themselves to once a day putting out a basin of some sort of gruel on the upper part of one of the staircases, which he empties from time to time. But the others seem to be cowering into themselves, as if from some evil approach. Only Nancy and Uriel show no reaction. My sister relieves Sambucus of his cup, which is chattering horribly on its saucer. My cousin is feigning sleep, but there is a glimmer of green fire under her closed eyelids. She must be watching the lamentable apparition of Tenebrio. Be on your ways, Nancy says brusquely, addressing the whole company. You're most polite, mademoiselle, Eleanor Cormelin grates out. Are you waiting for me to have you thrown out? Nancy, Uncle Didaloo interpolates. I beg you, you, Nancy growls. You'll hold your tongue and be the first to go. So you're in charge here, mademoiselle grandsire? Rosalie Cormelin asks. It's taken you some time to grasp it. She lights the candles, Lampernice explains, and they're candles that don't go out. Nobody blows them out. May she be blessed. He is dancing about in the light projecting on the far wall, an ungainly shadow, which Filarete, who is supposedly not quite all there, in the fever of these brief and disagreeable events, tries to avoid, as if it were tangible and malevolent. My colors! Lampernice cries, dancing with renewed vigor before the minuscule bonfires. They're all there. I shan't sell them, and nobody else can. He takes on a perplexed look, and from the depths of his filthy gray mane, his eyes beseech Nancy, unless it's the one who puts out the lamps. O goddess. With a gesture, Nancy cuts short the assembly, the gesture of a reaper laying low the sanding corn. We shall see each other in 3 days. The shadows advance toward the door with the slow pace of processionaries. Uriel followed in her mother's footsteps. She had opened her eyes, but their green flame was lifeless now, and she seemed scarcely to see. Uncle Didaloo hesitated a moment on the threshold. I had the impression he wanted to say something to Nancy, and then thought better of it and slipped into the darkness of the hallway. The short halt cost him his place in the line, and Alice, the youngest of the Misses Cormelin, overtook him. Suddenly I heard a cry of pain. Nancy broke into a tiny pearl of strident laughter. His mania has him in its grasps now, she giggled. But Dr. Sambucus had unearthed a thin bamboo cane from somewhere or other and was mercilessly laying into the wretched Lampernice. Oh, ah, the great puppet lamented. The devils are always beating me. They want my colors, but I haven't got them anymore. And they beat me, they beat me. Crying out as he went, he rushed up the staircase. We saw his misshapen silhouette glide, simian, over the walls, lit up by the lamps ranged from the landing to landing. There's another, he yelled suddenly. Something black and formless flickered over the walls and the high lidded windows. And another, and another. Oh, it's there, and I can't see it. Light and colors. He's taken them and left me in darkness. Everybody come into the kitchen, Nancy commanded. The madman is telling the truth. The thing that puts out the lamps is there. Somebody in the darkness. I don't know who, repeated slowly. The thing that puts out the lamps. Nancy shrugged her shoulders. I have always loved my sister dearly, but she has always baffled me. Through all the events that have shaken us like twigs in a squall, it seems to me that woven Women have been more level headed than men. Alas, from my very first steps into this world of mysteries, I have stumbled into conjectures, and even perhaps into accusing my sister of indifference. For if she had known, would she not perhaps have been able to thwart the most fatal of destinies? Very well, then, said Elodie, laying aside her rosary, and then, without saying a word, she set the wine to heat with sugar and spices. It's a fine evening, Sambucus said. What would you say, you young people, to a midnight meal? Old Kassav used to love one. Food and drink take on an extra flavor and aroma at midnight. We owe that discovery to the wisdom of the ancients. The midnight meal was a respectable repast, and a tongue in sauce being served. Dr. Sambucus took advantage of the situation to inform us of the banquet given by Xanthus, the Phrygian, at which Aesop was served tongues of every kind, and only tongues, proclaiming them at once the greatest and worst delicacy. Having seen Sambucus satiated and bloated as a little python, Nancy retired to her room. Elodie and I kept watch over the sleeping Kassav. For the night he had donned a skull cap of bergamo fabric, embroidered with golden floss that gave him by the glow of the floating wick of the night light so grotesque an air that I began to laugh quietly to myself. Uncle did indeed die on the third day, and in the few hours that preceded his passing, he was extraordinarily lucid and loquacious. But his eyes were already piercing into other different depths. Time and again he cried out, "Why have they taken away that painting by the Mabuse? Charles Didaloo, you crook! Put it back where it belongs. Nothing shall leave this house. Nothing. Do you hear me?" Nancy came to calm him. "Tell me, my lovely," he said, taking my sister's hands between his long clawed paws. "Tell me the names of those in this room here, because there are only shadows where there should be people." The notary Champ is sitting at the table with his paper pens and an inkwell. Good. Champ knows his job. The notary, an old man of austere and honest countenance, greeted the dying man, although he was well aware Kassav could not see him. "Who is sitting next to him?" "There is only a vacant chair, uncle." "Have you summoned Isengott, you she-devil?" "Of course, uncle. My brother Jean-Jacques is sitting next to you." "Excellent. I'm pleased. Ah, Jean-Jacques, my young friend. Your grandfather was also my friend, and God, what a friend. He was a splendid rogue. He must be waiting for me now in some corner of eternity, which pleases me. The Misses Cormelin are here. Carrion attracts the crows. Well, Eleanor, Rosalie, and you too, Alice, although you're the youngest, and by a damned sight the prettiest. We've been on the best of terms now for a good long while. You understand me, of course. There are times when it is given to us to understand, eh? Ugly you may be, but the devil has put decent brains into your nasty heads. I owe you some of my last words, and since I imagine I owe you something else as well, I shall soon pay that debt. Cousin Filarete, he is my cousin. His blood is my own. He can't help it, and what's more, neither can I. He has every right to be here, although I'm inclined to think God himself couldn't make a stupider man. Filarete too bowed as if Uncle Kassav had been lauding him to the skies. Kassav caught the gesture and smiled. Filarete was not a faithless servant, he said gently. Matthias Crook, Nancy murmured after a brief hesitation. Uncle Kassav seemed vexed. In excluding him from this company, he said, I am possibly doing him an injustice. Well, he'll find consolation. So let him go back to the shop. He likes it there. The old man had turned laboriously over onto his side to try to watch the youth go. I thought I could read in his expression a singular indecision. I've been mistaken in my time, Crook. Not often, it's true, but I haven't the time now to mend my ways or undo my errors. Just or not, off you go. Matthias Crook disappeared from view, a miserable, shamefaced smile on his features. Nancy was looking daggers. Dr. Sambucus has just come in. Shove him in an armchair and give him something to nibble on. The Graboynes are here. They were my good and faithful servants for more years than I care to add up. They will remain so. Lampertuis is sitting on the bottom step of the staircase. He's watching over a lamp that's still burning. Uncle Kassav burst into a peal of sinister laughter. Let him stay there till it's blown out, and blown out it will be. Here are Uncle Charles Diddleu, Aunt Sylvie, and Ural. The dying man grimaced. There was a time when Sylvie was beautiful. She isn't any longer. I'm just as pleased not to see her. She was still beautiful when Uncle Charles came upon her at Great Uncle, Great Uncle, Uncle Charles cried out in an anguished voice. I implore you. Go on then, Uriel, my lovely flower. Go and sit down next to your cousin, Jean Jacques. You two are the double hope I take away with me from this earth. A voice outside was begging. No, no, don't put out the lamp. A man of imposing aspect entered and sat down beside the notary champ without appearing to notice us. Isengard is there, Uncle Kassav cried. I have come, said a voice that rang like a bell. I stared at the newcomer in terror and respect. His face was very pale and very long, made longer still by an immense ashen beard that hung down, covering his chest like a waistcoat. His eyes were fixed and black, and his hands were so fine they seemed to have been borrowed from a recumbent figure on a church tomb. He was shabbily dressed, and his green frock coat shone at the seams. Scamp, said Uncle Kassav, these people are my heirs. Tell them the total of the fortune I shall be leaving. The notary bent over his papers and with deliberation pronounced the figure. It was so enormous, so formidable, so fantastic that for a moment we were all flabbergasted. It was Aunt Sylvie who broke the spell cast by that golden number. Charles, she exclaimed, you shall hand in your notice. Naturally, Uncle Kassav chuckled. He couldn't do otherwise. This fortune, the notary declared, is not to be divided among the co-owners. A muttering of terrified disappointment arose, but the notary cut it short and continued. On the death of Quentin Moretus Kassav, all these persons here present, on pain of immediate exclusion from inheritance and loss of all future advantage, will live and continue to live under this roof. But we have a house, our own property, Eleanor Carmelin wailed. Don't interrupt, the notary said severely. They will live there until their death, but each will receive an annual income, that is to say, a life annuity of. Once again, the figure that fell from the notary's lips was prodigious. I heard the eldest of the Carmelin sisters mumbling, we'll sell the house. Each one of them will have the right of board and lodging, in respect of which the testator demands the best possible. The Gerboin couple, whilst having the same advantages as the rest, will remain servants and will not forget this fact. The notary paused. No changes will be made to the house of Malpertuis, and the entire fortune will be vested in the last survivor. The paint supplier's shop will be considered in the same terms as the house itself, and Matthias Crook will remain the assistant, his wages tripled and guaranteed for life. Only the last survivor will have the right to close the said shop. Isengard, who shall derive no advantage, to whom nothing is due, and who wants nothing, shall oversee the perfect execution of these wishes. The notary turned to the last page of the document. There follows a codicil. If the last two survivors be a man and a woman, the Diddleu couple being de facto excluded, they shall become man and wife, and the fortune shall revert to them in equal parts. A silence hung over the company. They had not yet taken in what had been disclosed. Such are my wishes, Uncle Kassav said in a firm tone. And so it shall be, the somber Isengard responded gravely. Sign, the notary champ commanded. They all signed. Cousin Filarete put a cross. Be off with you, said Uncle Kassav, whose face had suddenly become drawn. Isengard, you will remain. We retired to the dimness of the yellow drawing room. Who will be meeting the cost of our move here? The elder Carmelin asked. I will, Nancy declared. And why you, mademoiselle? Would you like me to have Isengard tell you? My sister inquired quietly. It seems to me, Uncle Charles broke in. Never mind what it seems to you, Nancy exploded. In any case, here's Monsieur Isengard. He walked to the center of the room, brooding over us with his terrible and somber gaze. Monsieur Cassave wishes Jean-Jacques and Ural to help him in his last moments. Every head was bowed, even Nancy's. Uncle Cassave was barely breathing, and his eyes reflected the light like glass marbles. In your chair, Jean-Jacques, sit in your chair, and you, Uriel, come close to me. My cousin slipped gracefully over to him, obedient but oddly indifferent to the strange majesty of the moment. Open your eyes, daughter of the gods, my uncle murmured in a voice that was utterly changed and which seemed to have in it a terrified respect. Open your eyes and help me die. Uriel bent over him. He gave a long, drawn out sigh, and I heard a few words escape him and dissolve into the silence. My heart in Malpertuis, a stone among the stones. My cousin remained motionless for so long that I took fright. Uriel, I pleaded. She turned to me, a singular smile on her lips. From beneath her half closed eyelids, there filtered only a distant stare, lacking life and thought. Uncle is dead, she said. And then a prolonged lamentation broke out on the stairs. He's blown out the lamp. I was watching so closely, and yet he put it out. Oh, it's gone out. Chapter 2. Malpertuis described. The genie of the night bore off the fox's head wherewith to adorn his house and do it honor. The tales of Hussein. The sun, give me the sun. Ibsen, ghosts. The lesser gods, such as the Penates, the Brownies, or the Glasmanchen, are never spirits but minuscule incarnations and thus absolutely material, and draw their power from the earth in which they live. Worth, comparative folklore. Now that I must describe Malpertuis, I find myself stricken with a strange impotence. The image recedes like the castle of Morgan Le Fay. The brush becomes like lead in the painter's head. So many things I would like to fix by description or definition vanish, become vague, and dissolve into misty nothingness. Were it not for my excellent teacher, the Abbé Dusdame, who often obliged me to see rather than merely look, I should have turned aside from the task. 6 weeks before Uncle Cassave died, we had left our house on the Quai de la Blaise for Malpertuis. The house on the quay will remain sweet in my memory. It was small and strangely constructed. Its green glass windows bathed in it an aquarium light of infinite gentleness. It smelled of verbena and tobacco, the tobacco the Abbé Dusdame, a regular guest, smoked. The door opened onto a hall, the one spacious place under that narrow roof. A hall watched over by the portrait of my father, Captain Nicholas Grandsire, guarded in its turn by fearsome suits of armor. The captain used to send us sufficient money to meet the rent and to permit us to live without undue worry. But toward the time when Uncle Cassave summoned us, the checks on the banks of Singapore, Shanghai, or Canton had become increasingly meager and infrequent. In the days of our relative prosperity, Elodie had kept open house to certain friends, and the Abbé Dusdame was the most respected among them, as well as the most assiduous. He was a small man, plump and rotund, and as a hogshead, with a cheerful moon face and a greasy soutane. He loved good cooking, and Elodie's cooking was of the first order. Reputable wines, Dutch tobacco, and old books. His name has not been engulfed in oblivion, and rightly not, for it is associated with certain publications that still retain a degree of authority. Thus, we are indebted to him for an elaborate study of the engravings of Wendell Ditterlin, a most original biography of Garrett Dew, and research into the artistic ironwork of the 15th century. He continued the curious studies of Dr. Mises of Leipzig, and concerning the forms, the language, and the comparative anatomy of angels. He held that these celestial spirits express their thoughts by means of light, and that to this end they make use of colors instead of sounds. He regularly said his office never shirked a moment of his breviary, and lived a life of exemplary chastity and humility. But this did little to endear him to his superiors. His having resumed Dr. Mize's studies had, in effect, won him an unwarranted reputation as a heretic, and even a few punitive retreats in especially austere monasteries. But the youth of that priest had been spent in distant and dangerous climes, where the glory of God is defended at the cost of the suffering and the blood of the soldiers of Christ, and even meddlesome and whining bishops did not dare deny it. Had Dustame come to know Captain Nicholas Grandsire in the course of those perilous adventures? He never said anything himself on that score, and my father contented himself with concluding his letters. Kindest regards to the saintly tattoo. May God protect him for the sake of the happiness of the poor in this life and for their access to eternal glory. What's a tattoo? Elodie would ask suspiciously. It's a fat beast, like myself, the Abbé Dustam would explain. However, it has remained on the banks of the Amazon, which I haven't done, seeing as I'm here to drink good wine and eat good things. And I'll deserve divine mercy, and ill deserve divine mercy. How? I asked him, pretending to take notes. Do you explain the name Malpertuis, which Uncle Cassav's house seems to bear as if it were a curse? Before giving an explanation, the Abbe Dustam assumed an incongruous air of grave attention. In the celebrated and uncourtly Roman de Renard, the clerics gave that name to the lair of the cunning and evil fox Goupil. I would not wish to venture an opinion as to whether Malpertuis means the house of evil or the house of militia, of cunning. Now, militia, cunning, is the prerogative of the spirit of darkness. By extension of the postulate thus posed, I would say that it means la maison de la man, la maison de Malin, the house of the devil. The house maison du malin, the house of the devil. I made a grimace of fear. My own personal inclination, however, is for the fox, pure and simple. On the lintels of the double windows of the facade, there are some disagreeable carvings. Arrowhead squids, heraldic serpents devouring babes, herpetons, itemize the abbey. And among those carvings, the foxes' heads are the pleasantest. The stone corbels of the projecting beams bear the same motifs. They're wicked-looking thing. Big-eared dogs and nothing more. But don't jump to conclusions, my young friend. Don't jump to conclusions. The representation of the fox belongs by right to demonology. The Japanese, who are masters of that somber and dreaded science, have made the fox a sorcerer, a mighty thaumaturge, and a nocturnal spirit gifted with the most extensive infernal powers. I have seen 7 grimoires, the reading of which, much less the knowledge of which, I must condemn without mercy, in which the engravings representing the battle between Saint Michael and the rebellious angel give the defeated evil one the mean and perverse aspect of the fox. Unfortunately, the archives, and I have consulted them time to time again, have not revealed to me the reason for the choice of this name for Uncle Cassav's house. I believe we owe it to the principal Barbuscan monks, owners in the past times of the principal outbuildings of that dwelling, which I find dismal and menacing. Tell me about the Barbuscan order, I said abruptly, knowing perfectly well that he was disinclined to touch upon the subject. With his plump little arms, he would gesture his helplessness and vexation. That order, oh, come now, my boy. The fact is, it never existed. The denomination is merely popular. The good monks of whom you would speak were reformed Cistercians who suffered greatly from the depredations of vagabonds by land and sea in the times of the great revolt of the Netherlands against his Catholic Majesty. Nonetheless, I persisted. Perhaps your monks had beards. No, no, you're falling into a popular delusion. Those monks wore a barbute, a cowl that enveloped their chins, and so too their beards. And it is there, perhaps, that the reason for their name is to be found. But I do not go so far as to assert this, still less to commit it to writing. Let us leave the dead in peace, especially when they were holy men of many virtues, born of suffering and persecution. Aha, Abbe! I have a feeling tradition will decide quite differently. Be quiet, the Abbe Dustam implored. Tradition is a detestable peddler of errors to which, alas, the devil lends a long and tenacious life. After setting down this conversation, which was not unique, but repeated on a number of occasions in a similar manner, I feel better prepared to resume the description of Malpertuis. I have often pored over ancient engravings of the town, portraying old streets heavy with boredom and disdain, streets resistant to every effort to animate them with life and movement. Among these, I had no trouble in finding the Rue de Vieux Chantier, where Malpertuis is situated, and without undue trouble, I made out the house itself, set amongst its tall and sinister neighbors. There it stands, with its enormous pillared balconies, its flights of steps flanked with heavy stone banisters, its cruciferous turrets, its gemel barred windows, its grimacing sculptured child eating serpents and terroresques, its studded doors. It exudes the arrogance of its inhabitants and the terror of those who skirt its outer walls. Its facade is a severe mask in which the beholder vainly seeks any serenity, a face feverishly twisted in rage and anguish that fails to conceal the abominations that lie behind it. Those who lie down to sleep in its vast rooms lay themselves open to nightmares. Those who spend their days there are obliged to habituate themselves to the company of the atrocious shades of executed criminals, of men flayed alive, or walled up, or otherwise tormented. Such must have been the unbidden thoughts of the passers-by who halts a while in its shadow, and who immediately makes off to the end of the road where there are few trees, a murmuring fountain, a white stone dovecote, and a chapel dedicated to Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows. Alas, that is what turns me abruptly away from my project. The Abbé Dustam put into words everything that the old archives might have been able to tell of that house, but which they did not tell. I have entered Malpertuis. I belong to it. It makes no mystery of its interior. There is no door that insists upon remaining closed, no room that balks at my curiosity. There is no forbidden chamber, no secret passage. And yet, at every exploratory step, it contrives to remain mysterious. And at every exploratory step, it continues to encompass a shifting prison of shadows. The Abbe Dustam has sometimes manifested a certain curiosity concerning its garden, which is as extensive as a park and surrounded by a wall so high, so formidable, that it is only toward midday that the sun projects the shadow of its ragged crest. When one leans out of the upper windows of the house and looks down, the garden is like a broad, flat, grassy expanse from which centuries old trees burst like water spouts. In fact, the grass is sparse and coarse, the spindle bushes are skimpy, and the brushwood has an undernourished look. Only the wild oats and the dock triumph over the ungrateful soil and sprout rankly at the base of the walls. The trees mount a jealous guard against the daylight and appear to be accommodating to all manner of larval life and a flourishing lushness of cryptogams. But such life as one might expect to find among trees remained exiled from that place. It is in vain that one might seek the jaunty swaggering of blackbirds, the timid flight of ringdoves, the bickering of jays. Once, at midnight, I heard the thin song of the woodlark, that mysterious lark of darkness, and the Abbe Dustam saw in this a sign of misfortune in Memis. There is, though, a long-legged water rail that lives among the Sagittaria in the central pond, and now and again its squealing note, like a file on metal, can be heard in foggy weather. The dotterel's weeping call comes trickling from the depths of the heavens. This pond, which is of some size, opens up suddenly on the far side of a barrier of stunted oaks that stand crowded together, their short, gnarled branches intertwined. The inky blackness of the waters betray their enormous depth. They are so icily cold as to seem to bite the hand plunged into them. Despite this, they are well provided with fish, and Graboyne catches mirror carp, gleaming perch, and great bluish eels there in a garbon bow net, one of the kind called a bergot. Some 40 yards from the southern bank of the pond is a second hedge, this one of tall and gloomy conifers, so rebarbative that one hesitates to pass it. Once past this gloom enshrouded and prickly barrier, one finds oneself facing a building of improbable ugliness, its stones blighted, rotted, as if with leprosy, its windows broken, its roof gaping, the ruins of the ancient monastery of the Barbasquins. A gigantic flight of high stone steps leads up to the iron-bound door. My good Abbe Dustam needed to pluck up his courage before climbing those steps, and then give himself over to the exploration of those miserable quarters, so well defended by their hideousness. He had proposed devoting a short book to the ruins. In the event, he took some ill-ordered and widely excited notes, but he never put together the little work from which he nonetheless had counted upon deriving some fame. I am amazed, he wrote, at the discomfort in which the good monks lived here, and I would go so far as to claim that they sought herein a means of holy penitence. The cells are cramped with low ceilings. They are poorly lit and ventilated. The tables and benches in the refectory are of coarse gray stone. The chapel is so dark and lofty as to be like a well. Nowhere, the vast and forbidding kitchens excepted, is there any trace of fires or fireplaces. Part of the cellars would appear to have been fitted out as laboratories, for one still finds their massive flues, a brickwork alembic of considerable proportions, water conduits, and the troughs of forges. In days gone by, the learned monks may perhaps at times have become addicted to spagria, even though the practice was condemned. Likewise, I cannot but be surprised at the unusual extent of the cellars, now unexplorable as a consequence of the collapses in parts of the ceiling, partial flooding and patches of ruderal vegetation that might be of interest to an informed botanist. It is evident that the epoch, sadly rich in persecutions, obliged the good monks to provide themselves with this species of retreat and the means of communication or flight. I should have liked to have handed over to the abbey the exploration, manifestly the softer option of the house itself, but this he refused with an obstinacy that sometimes bordered on the ill-tempered. On the rare occasions on which he put in an appearance there, he would remain huddled in his chair, his head bowed, his lips compressed, his hands damp and trembling, and during the long intervals of silence that ensued on such visits, I suspected him of having muttered complicated exorcisms. No doubt God, whose humble servant he was, had vouchsafed him a glimpse of the dreadful fate reserved for that fearful house, which he accepted as the saints accepted martyrdom. Only the lugubrious kitchen found favor in his terrified eyes. Elodie played her part in his tolerating, perhaps even challenging other presences which were occult, invisible, but nonetheless formidable. The poor dear man's besetting sin was the deadly sin of gluttony. He would sigh deeply when faced with soufflés à la mole, gigots of lamb fragrant with garlic, or the steamingly rich fowl our cook would set before him on the gleaming oaken table. His soul tormented with remorse, he would pick with his fork at his over rich delicacies, cutting into fillets, crushing the stewed fruits, and as he ate his sauce bedewed lips would attempt a vague smile, intended to be sour and woebegone, but which would by degrees modulate into one of happy contentment. In the long run, he managed to convince himself of the innocence of his greedy pleasures. If God has scattered the quiet hollows of the meadows with mushrooms, if he has placed a fleshy comb on the cock's peaked skull, if he has caused the wild garlic to flourish in sheltered valleys and permitted the Madeira grape to ripen in southern regions, his aim was not to make salami, whose flavor they enhance, an agent of damnation. In any case, they ate poorly at the table of Minos. So he went on, but he would shudder if he mentioned the name of the prince of darkness, and a faint anxiety would trouble his frank, blue eyed gaze. I frequently raised questions that troubled the good abbé, especially when they touched on Malpertuis, on Uncle Cassav, and indeed on my father, Nicholas' grandsire. He would pontificate at such moments. There are books, he would insist, in which once one has read a page, one cannot turn back. Life is afflicted with a chronic crick in the neck, which prevents one from ever taking a backward glance. Let us do likewise. The past belongs to death, and death keeps a watchful eye on what belongs to him. Death had to relinquish Lazarus, I would reply. Will you hold your tongue, you young wretch? But Lazarus hadn't much to say for himself. Ah, if only he had been able to leave us his memoirs. And the Abbe Dustam would get annoyed. The way you express yourself without either consideration or respect involves me in thoroughly unpleasant supplementary penances, he used to complain. Taking leave of him on the threshold of Malpertuis, I used to sometimes to restrain him, laying hold of the tails of his old sustain. Why did Uncle Cassav buy a shop? I would accompany him into the street and oblige him to turn and face the oddly coupled pair of facades, that of the proud house and the strange shop with its lusterless windows. It was a narrow building without architectural distinction, and although it dated from the times when art and harmony were the rule, its high pointed gable, surmounted by a weathercock and a sandstone turret, leaned backwards, as if it had received a brutal blow. Its windows were hardly more than double loopholes, with bottled green panes that, at first sight, gleamed as if waxed. The old sign still hung over the door, Lampernice, couleurs et vernis. Why, I would insist. Why Nancy and Matthias Crook spend their days there and they never do 5 francs worth of business? In replying, the Abbey would sometimes assume an air of mystery. Colors. Ah, my poor dear boy, you should remember the magnificent study of Dr. Mises. Colors, the words of angels. Uncle Kassav wished to steal something from our celestial friends. But hush, it isn't good to speak of these things. One never knows what entities are on the alert to hear our words and our thoughts. With an abrupt movement, he would disengage his sustain and make off. Without looking back, on windy days, the tempest would whip up his coattails, making them look like great black wings. My dear Elodie was a simple but sensible woman. God keeps his own counsel and punishes those men who seek to cast a profane slur upon it, she would reply to my idle words. Why shouldn't the devil who apes all things that are God's wish to do as much? Be content, Jean-Jacques, to live according to his law, to renounce the devil in all his works, to say your rosary daily and piously. It is also good to wear a scapular and call upon the names of certain meritorious saints. And no doubt she was right, if, as we shall see, the tide of horror had thundered about Elodie as it did about others. The gloomy spell of Malpertuis would not have been able to directly assail her. The ceremonial installation I openly admit the expression is a trifle high flown. Of the new inhabitants of Malpertuis took place without undue disturbances or difficulties. Cousin Filarete was by a comfortable margin the first to arrive, his scanty effects piled on a handcart he pushed himself. Nancy had reserved for him a vast room overlooking the garden, which he immediately declared himself well satisfied. Within a couple of hours, it reeked of formaldehyde, idioform, and spirits of wine. He loaded the table with cupules, brain extractors, tweezers, balls of cotton wool, saucers filled with glass eyes and coloring powders. A lifeless but startlingly lifelike fauna loomed on all sides, on the shelves and on the furniture, encompassing the bejeweled azure of the kingfisher and the black elegance of the sand martin, ranging from the wary look of a silvery weasel to the snarling defiance of an Australian lizard, from the velvety softness of red-bested mergansers to the livid emaciation of reptiles. Cousin Jean-Jacques, Filarete proposed, we really ought to come to an arrangement. In a big garden like that, you ought to be able to catch me plenty of beasts, furred or feathered. It doesn't matter much which. I could turn them out for you even prettier than if they were alive. All I've ever seen is a scruffy water rail, I replied unenthusiastically. Get him for me, and you'll see whether he'll turn out as a nasty a bird as you say he is. The Didaloo family arrived without any fuss. When I came upon them in the roomy first floor apartment, Nancy had ungrudgingly set aside for them. Aunt Sylvie was already at work embroidering a bulky blue canvas, and Uncle Charles was rehanging a picture. My cousin Uriel had retired to her own room and did not deign to put in an appearance. As might have been expected, the Misses Cormelin proved to be less accommodating. True, my sister had relegated them to a suite of rooms at the end of an echoing, stone flagged passage, so lofty as to be like so many chapels, but they criticized everything, and even the fine Gobelin tapestries on the walls found no favor in their eyes. The creatures in them are enough to give you nightmares, they complained. We'll need every bit of 30 candles to light each of those rooms properly, Eleanor declared firmly. Nancy's reply was sharp and apt. There are 6 to a room, but seeing that Champ has provided the first monthly payment in advance, you're well able to provide the other 2 dozen yourselves. We'll spend our money as we see fit, was the shrill response, and in this matter we can manage without your advice. Dr. Sambucus was awarded a strange and quite amusing room, completely round in shape, part of a tower flanking the west wing of the house. He found it to his taste, preferring, so he said, the splendid mellowness of sunsets to the insolent ardor of dawns. Nancy encountered Lampernice as he was pouring oil into one of the lamps in the hallway. She offered him a little room quite well lit and comfortable in the south annex. He refused it angrily. No, no, I don't want it. Oh, goddess, he must not know where I live. I hide where he cannot find me and steal the light and the colors. As always, Nancy smiled, and he decamped, wailing. The dining room, where the inhabitants were compelled to gather twice daily for lunch at midday and for supper at 7, was vast, and it was certainly the only sumptuous room in that grim dwelling. The dark wooden furniture, inlaid with ebony and rosy mother of pearl, took on the light of the lamps and the tall twisted candles. The gleaming depths of gems of the first water, cascades of aventurines streamed in the space where the midday sun's beam pierced the stained glass windows. A hearth of unusual dimensions looked something like a house fire once the logs were lit. It was flanked by andirons and solid silver fire dogs. The Gerboin couple, willingly helped by Elodie, served at table, and, in keeping with the will of the late Uncle Cassav, every meal there was like a banquet. Although the table companions gave the impression of having come together with the plain intention of showing themselves to be as formal and as nicely spoken as possible, I admit that the first meal was almost diverting. The Misses Cormelin ate enough for 4, asking for second helpings of everything, with the sole purpose of consuming as much as possible of what was theirs by right. Aunt Sylvie, having simpered with regret before the hors d'oeuvres, bravely attacked the roast and guzzled with a will, greasing her table napkin and splashing the cloth. Uncle Diddaloo quickly came to appreciate the rare quality of the wines, and his lecherous regard lingered over my sister's abundantly rounded forms. Dr. Sambucus, seated next to Cousin Filarete, immediately hit it off with him. Ah, the taxidermist warbled in his voracious enthusiasm. I don't know what this is I'm eating, but it's devilish good. It's a filet au porto a la purée de noisette, the old doctor explained. I wonder if they couldn't have it again tomorrow, Filarete asked, nudging him with his elbow. He took great pleasure in admiring the little figures decorating the wonderful moustier plates on which the risotto rome was served with fresh cream. There's a devil with 6 horns on mine, he exclaimed. How about yours, doctor? Aha! A fellow drinking from a barrel. He tried to look at the other plates, to the great annoyance of the Misses Corellin, who covered theirs with their table napkins, while asking Cousin Filarete whether he had any acquaintance at all with good society. The poor fellow failed to see any malice at all in their inquiry, and answered that he had undoubtedly just made his entry into the very best of society. Nancy, who was not at heart an unpleasant girl, seemed to take a real pleasure in the first breaking of the ice, but I felt rather at a loss as regards Urail. She sat stiff and upright in her chair, eating little, and that with a manifest displeasure. Her eyes, peering abstractly into vacancy, were lusterless, and even when by chance they fell on me, I had the impression she did not see me. She was wearing a wretched little dress of uncertain color. It was too tight and flattened her figure. But at the least movement of her head, her awe-inspiring tresses were illuminated in glowing red glints and were as if alive. Once the table was cleared, Uncle Charles proposed they amuse themselves. To my amazement, the Misses Corellin opted for a game of whist, with Uncle as fourth. Cousin Filarete chortled with delight when Dr. Sambucus challenged him to a game of checkers. Aunt Sylvie curled up in an armchair and went to sleep. To Uncle Diddaloo's obvious disappointment, Nancy precipitately vanished. Without my being aware of her coming, Urail appeared at my side. I experienced a strange, almost painful sensation at the back of my neck. She had placed her hand there, and her fingers were hard and cold. They remained there so long that I felt as if my being were freezing into eternity. The crystalline notes of a wall clock sounded 11. The Misses Cormelin were chuckling with pleasure. Uncle Diddaloo had lost a couple of francs. You're a much better player than I thought, Filarete, said Dr. Sambucus with a touch of regret. I regularly play checkers at the Petit Marquis. The taxidermist excused himself. But Peckinbot, the cobbler, often beats me. You'll have to learn chess, Sambucus proclaimed. Aunt Sylvie woke up yawning. Gold gleamed in her mouth. Jean-Jacques, Urail murmured. What's that? I replied quietly, but with a considerable effort, for a strange torpor had been weighing me down ever since she had rested her hand on the back of my neck. Listen to me, but don't say anything. Of course, Urail. When all these people are dead, except ourselves, you will marry me. I should have liked to have turned and looked at her, but her hand grew still heavier and colder upon me, and I could not make the slightest movement. But a pier glass facing us reflected our images. In it, I saw 2 green, immobile flames burning, like 2 enormous moonstones in the depths of a nocturnal lake. Chapter 3: The Song of Songs. I saw the Capitano, his head nailed to the mast, and I realized that he had just been struck down by the gods. Wilhelm Hauff, the phantom ship. The autumn came and went, spreading neither joy nor glory over the town. It is possible that beyond the ramparts it gilded the woods, that it padded the rutted tracks with soft heaps of leaves, easy underfoot, that it drew the hymn of its fecundity from the harp of the orchards, and scattered generous handfuls of sane and healthy pleasures. But once within the city limits, it showed itself sparing in its largesse and its smiles. The facades of the house wept, saturated with deep sorrows. The streets were filled with the sharp sound of running water. A phantom hand impatiently rattled every door, every window, at the mercy of the gusting winds. Isolated on the embankments, the trees were no more than skeletal charcoal sketches, and the dead leaves carried on the wind lashed at the faces of passers by. The chimneys of Malpertuis, adorned with armorial bearings, belched forth heavy columns of smoke into the gray air, for in every room a vast fire of logs and coal was roaring. When the silvery note of the wall clocks struck 4, when the insistent scent of coffee rose from the kitchens, the Graboynes would hasten about the house, bearing lighted lamps, which they set down in their usual positions, at the angles of corridors on landings, and in niches in the hall. Malpertuis never seemed more somber than when spangled with these remote and smoky stars. At these times, the distant prospect of the paint supplier's shop, which could be glimpsed at the far end of one of the lateral corridors of the ground floor, assumed the reassuring air of a haven of light. I would often have made my way in that direction had I not met with the silent hostility of Nancy and Matthias Crook. The shop was their domain, and they made it plain that they had no intention of sharing its advantages with anybody. At times, a shadow huddled on a staircase would sob and sigh as I passed. It was Lampernice, who, from afar, kept watch over this lost paradise. I should have liked to become his friend, for he inspired in me a strange pity and even a kind of confused affection. But he avoided me, just as he fled the presence of each and all of us. I persisted, however, seeking to surprise him on his rounds and exchange with him a few brief friendly words. I was to some extent recompensed for this persistence. If the first harrowing discovery I made in Malpertuis, thanks to Lampernice, might be called a recompense. The first phantom to rise up before me was that common to all sequestered lives, ennui. Day in, day out, it rained, and at certain times the downpour would take on the character of a raging deluge. There was no counting upon the garden and its repulsive mysteries to distract myself from the dismal and silent hours I spent in the house. The leafless branches of the trees clashed together. The rain lashed earth erupted into blisters and pustules that broke and dissolved into mud. During the brief spells of respite, when the branches and the twigs, as it were, drew breath, one could hear the surly lapping sound of the waters of the pond. The house possessed a well stocked library, but I am no great reader. In any case, the books, bound in somber leather, smelled of moldy boots. When I did once venture a visit there, I found Uncle Didaloo and Alice, the youngest of the Cormellan sisters, already in possession. I was aware of gestures of embarrassment, and my uncle attempted to get on his high horse. A well educated young man never enters a room without knocking. I'm not a well educated young man, I retorted, and it's not as if I expected to find anything here but mice. I slammed the door behind me as I left, after the manner of Nancy, and I reflected that Alice Cormellan was not, when it came to the point, particularly ugly. Thereafter, Uncle Didaloo treated me very coolly, but the youngest Cormellan sister would cast looks in my direction, in which anxiety was blended with a vague smile of complicity. I still found a refuge with Elodie. Nevertheless, at those times when her stoves did not demand her attention, she was absorbed in her rosary with her prayer book. We must say a prayer to Saint Venerande, asking her to intercede for a change in the weather so we can have a bit of sun and you can go and amuse yourself in the garden. Noble et sans vénérable, à vous je fais humble offrande. I had no idea it was that I was humbly offering Saint Venerand. I left the kitchen well before the end of the pious evocation and went in search of refuge with cousin Filarete. If it were not for the heavy atmosphere of the room, I think I might have found a fairly lasting diversion there, but the almost visible odor of carbolic that hung in the place made me retch. The taxidermist was always working on some disgusting treasure, the sickening evolution of which he loved to show me. You must bring me animals, my boy. I haven't got many, and to tell the truth, I find it difficult to get hold of them here. When it stops raining, couldn't you give a thought to that water rail that lives in the garden? One day there was a new smell among the fingered fetters. Cousin Filarete, I blurted out. I've never seen you smoke. I don't smoke, cousin Jean Jacques. All the same, there's a smell of tobacco, and good tobacco too. It's the Abbe Dustam who smokes, not me. What's that? I exclaimed in astonishment. The Abbe Dustam comes here? He came here, Filarete replied curtly, and he snubbed me. I was not just surprised, but also hurt to hear that my excellent teacher had come to Malpertuis without my knowledge. I shall say nothing of Eleanor and Rosalie Carmelin, whose company I avoided and who certainly had no wish for mine. As for the Graboins, their concierge's lodge was as joyless as their persons. When I chanced to enter, those two polite and faithful servants afforded me the welcome reserved for a stranger whose coming is neither expected nor desired. They would inquire after my health, comment on the day's weather and on yesterday's, and predict tomorrow's, bidding me on my departure an effusive farewell. Things were no different with Aunt Sylvie, who adopted during my visits to her personal sitting room the silence and immobility of a statue, nor, alas, with Uriel, whom I desired with the feverish intensity of a treasure hunter, and who, outside of the hours we took our meals together, would vanish like a shadow, whom I never saw rounding the corner of a corridor, who never appeared in a doorway, whom one never expected to find seated in one of the drawing rooms, who never leaned out of a half open window. Ennui flitted about me on its shabby bat's wings, and it was ennui that drove me to seek out the incomprehensible, phantasmal, clownish figure so strangely haunted by the shadow of his shadow, Lampernice. One day, cousin Filarete drew me aside. I've made a new mousetrap. It's a fine piece of work, big and roomy, and it doesn't kill or injure the animals it catches. You know the house, cousin. You must set it for me in a good place, in the attics, for example. You'd only catch mice or rats. No doubt, no doubt. But whoever knows? Those old attics are a world all to themselves. I remember a certain Monsieur Lickendorf, who lived in the neighborhood of the docks and who caught a magnificent pink rat in a trap, an unknown species. And my friend Pickenbot, the cobbler, told me that in his mother's attics there are mice with trunks. And then again, Dr. Sambucus called out to my interlocutor, Hey there, Filarete, come and have your chess lesson. The taxidermist thrust a bulky cage trap into my hands, its hooks baited with chunks of bacon and leftover ends of cheese. Good hunting, cousin. You never know, eh? In itself, the matter aroused no interest in me, but the idea of exploring the attics of Malpertuis promised an antidote to my boredom. I climbed the endless stairs, some so broad and majestic as to seem to give access to temple halls, others twisting in narrow and precipitous spirals to end in trap doors I was obliged to force with my shoulders. And abruptly I was there. The place was made up of a succession of deeply indented polyhedra, picked out by the gray light of the dormer windows and œil de boeuf. It was completely empty. No rocking chair lurked there, relegated to an obscure corner. No outmoded chest leaned against the walls of tarnished bricks to avoid falling into dust. No set of worm-eaten suitcases was laid out on the floor, which was flush as the deck of a packet boat. It was cold, and the wind whistling over the roof tiles filled the emptiness there with its sighs and caterwauling. I threw the trap down, any old how, and beat a retreat, resolving to limit the services I rendered to cousin Filarete, to that one brief intrusion into the heights of Malpertuis. 2 days went by. I was awakened that morning earlier than usual by a gust of wind so violent that it all but burst open the French window of my room. In the wan light of a sinister dawn, tinted or tainted with the lemon yellow gleams of the rising sun, I caught sight of the garden tormented by the howling fury of a ferocious downpour of rain. I was shivering. A humid chill had crept like a snake under the sheets. At that hour, I thought Elodie must already be lighting the fires in the kitchen. It would be warm and pleasant there. I hastily left my room. A pallid light was playing over the corridors where the dead and dying lamps trailed a thick stench of cooling oil and burnt out wicks. I had reached the hall on the ground floor, which led to the kitchen stairs, when suddenly, through the banisters, a livid hand grasped me by the shoulder. I let out a cry. Shh, shh, don't call anybody. They mustn't know. A pitiful voice pleaded. I found myself face to face with Lampernice. He was trembling in every limb, and his fleshless silhouette was shuddering like a storm tossed bush. It was you, wasn't it, that set the trap? He sobbed. So you know then. I never have dared. Well, one of them's been caught. Come and see. I'd never dare to go there on my own. I'll keep behind you, well behind you. Do you think it's they who put out the lamps? It was useless to oppose the old man. His hand gripped my arm like a vice, and he drew me up the staircase at an amazing pace. I remade the ascent of the day before last, this time at a disconcerting velocity, for Lampernice was literally carrying me with him. Never could he have been more loquacious than in those febrile moments, nor happier, for amid the filthy growth that sprouted from his features, his eyes were burning with a fiery joy. He drew closer to me with an air of mystery, as if to impart a grave confidence. I know in my heart he's the one. But why can't he forget too? And at the same time forget me? Time and the powers here are subject to strange whims that impose on one by turns forgetfulness and memory. Suppose he had forgotten, and it was they who put out the lamps. I think I knew them. They're so angry at being small they make anyone large. But they didn't count among those who play a role in the workings of fate. No task was assigned to them. Now they can be caught in a miserable rat trap. Aha! I'd serve them right. I'll kill them, I'll torture them, and keep my lamps lit without anybody daring to rob me of my colors. I don't know what you're talking about, Lampernice, I said gently, nor do I understand you. Ah, he said, in this place, that's all anyone can say. His wild high spirits diminished as we reached the final flights of the narrow spiral stairs leading to the attic. Wait a moment, he murmured. Do you hear something? He was trembling so violently that his shuddering was communicated to my body like the abrupt discharges of a laden jar. And indeed, I did hear something. It was a fine, sharp sound, drilling into the eardrums, the sound of a minuscule file wielded frantically. From time to time, it was briefly silenced. During these short silences, the enraged chirping of birds could be heard. My God, Lampernice was sobbing. They are letting him loose. I rebuffed him jeeringly. Since when did rats make use of files to get their friends out of traps? The old man's livid claws closed on me like the talons of a bird of prey. Don't say another word. And above all, don't open the trap door. Otherwise, they'll be all over the house. There'll never be light again. You understand, you wretch. No lamps, no sun, no moon. It'll be the eternal night of damnation. Let's be off. On the far side of the trap door, I heard a sharp, snapping sound, as if of a stick breaking, a harsh cry, then laughter. Oh, that laughter! It was not loud, but so harsh it seemed made of forceps and scalpels. I struggled in Lampernice's grip, and with the help of a sly and well-placed kick that drew from him a yelp of pain, I freed myself. I want to see, I roared. The old man emitted a wild, raucous, bellowing sound and fell away. A moment later, I heard him racing blindly down the stairs, uttering dismal lamentations. It was now quite silent behind the trap door. I pushed it up with my shoulders. The pale, glimmering light of dawn was flickering through the dormer windows. A few feet from me lay the broken trap. I lifted it in fear and disgust. A red bead was shining feebly on the little slat of smoothed boxwood, a teardrop of fresh blood. And an inch away from it, gripping one of the baits, a hand, a neatly severed hand, the cut showing clean and pink, a perfect hand, its skin fine and brown, the size of a housefly. But from each finger of that ghastly miniature hand there grew a nail, sharply pointed as a needle and inornately long. I threw the trap and its hideous wonder as far as I could from me, into the darkest corner of the loft. It was still night in that ill lit attic, where the dawn light had hardly penetrated, and in that half light I saw something the size of which barely exceeded that of an ordinary rat. He was a being of human form, but hideously dwarfish. Behind it, other creatures, identical in all points, were massed together. They were grotesques, shameless, insect like parodies of the being made in the divine image. And these creatures, minuscule as they were the very expression of horror, rage, and menace. Anticipating an attack by these minute monstrosities, I let loose a piercing cry, and my retreat was every bit as precipitate as that of Lampernice. I fell headlong down the narrow, winding stairs. I leapt down the staircases, a flight at a time, and shot like an arrow along the landings. It was then that I saw Lampernice again. He was galloping through the corridors, brandishing a torch that trailed a long red tongue of flame. He was rushing from lamp to lamp, touching the flame to each wick, awakening discs of golden light in the darkness. Powerless and terrified, I watched his veins struggle against the darkness of Malpertuis. Hardly had he kindled into existence the flame of a lamp than a swift shadow detached itself from the wall, fell on the light, and extinguished it, re-establishing the darkness. And then Lampernice screamed. The torch was dead in his hand. In the days that followed, I saw nothing of Lampernice, although in the hours of darkness I could hear him, as always, coming and going and sobbing. Cousin Filarete said nothing further to me about his trap, and I, for my part, took good care not to mention it. Another event, incomparably sinister, was to monopolize the entire sum of the anguish laid upon my being. In the hall, on the ground floor, the gong had just sounded to announce supper. Everyone was hastening to respond to its call. Cousin Filarete's door was the first to open, and the good fellow called out to his friend Dr. Sambucus on the stairs. What have we got to eat this evening, Doc? I'm damnably hungry. You'd never imagine the appetite taxidermy gives you. And the old doctor replied, You can take it from me, it'll be a gigot de canamouche. The steps of the Carmelin sisters resounded on the echoing tiles like those of a platoon of soldiers. As for the Didaloo family, they were already installed in the dining room before the gong had been struck. The pulley of the plate hoist could be heard creaking, and the Graboynes were busily engaged with their tasks. Nancy, as befitted a proper mistress of the house, was first at her post by the table and at the serving hatch. The call would often surprise me in some distant part of the house, sometimes in the garden when the weather was not too foul. On this occasion, I was in the drawing room, where I had just appropriated 2 or 3 candles, which I intended to lay beside Lampernice's bowl of gruel, a present I knew he would find agreeable. I was shutting the door and making my way without haste to the dining room when I saw at the end of the corridor the brightly illuminated front window of the paint supplier's shop. I found this odd. Ordinarily, Matthias Crook would extinguish the gas lamp and shut the shop the moment Nancy left. Then he would hurry to go and take his meal at a neighboring cook shop, and as soon as he had put away the last mouthful, he would be back to meet my sister on the doorstep of Malpertuis, where they would chatter and laugh together until well after dark. For some time, my mind had been made up to tell the story of my adventure in the attic to somebody who would accept my singular confidences without a smile. I had, of course, thought of the Abbe Dustam, but he had not put in another appearance at Malpertuis. Although it was only rarely that I had occasion to converse at any length with Matthias Crook, I had a good deal of fellow feeling for him. He had a pleasant, girlish face, a brilliant, toothy smile, and showed himself distantly prepared to be friendly to me. His attractive, light tenor voice, rising from time to time from the inner recesses of the shop, made one forget the unduly brooding silences of Malpertuis. Nancy assured me that he composed his own songs, and one of them will ring like a dirge in my memory as long as I live. The seductive air, to the rhythm of a slow waltz, adapted itself, with a few hesitations, to the magnificent words of the Song of Songs. I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. Thy name is as ointment poured forth. Nancy was very fond of this song, and in her spells of good humor, she never tired of humming it. As I was looking at the lighted shop, Matthias's voice arose, and in the hostile night of the house, the Song of Songs spoke of love and of beauty. I had been waiting too long for the chance of a few words alone with Matthias Crook to allow the opportunity to pass. Eagerly, I traversed the corridor and entered the paint supplier's shop. To my astonishment, I found it completely empty, even though the singing came from somewhere very close by. I am the rose of Sharon. Matthias, I called out, and the valley and the lily of the valleys. Matthias Crook, I repeated, thy name is as ointment poured forth. The song ceased. All I now heard was the urgent murmur of the fluttering gas flame at the end of its copper pipe. Hey there, Matthias, why are you hiding? There's something I want to ask you. No, tell you rather. I am the rose of Sharon. I leapt back, blundering against the counter. The voice was louder. It was Matthias's voice. There was no doubting that. But it had suddenly taken on a new and increased plagency. And the lily of the valleys. I put my hands over my ears. The voice was rolling like thunder, setting the glass of the window panes and the jars vibrating. Thy name is as ointment poured forth. I could not remain there. This was no longer a human voice, but a furious cataract, a tidal wave of sounds and notes breaking against the walls, shattering the vaulted ceiling, rumbling about me in a nightmarish tornado of sonorities. I was about to flee, crying out for help, when I saw the singer. He seemed to be standing in the angle of the door, and he seemed immense, for he stood far higher above the counter than Matthias Crook normally did. By degrees, I took in the length of his body. I could not see his head, which was lost in the shadows, but I saw his hands long and white, his knees, which were slightly flexed and showed under the cloth of his trousers, and his feet. Ah, the shimmering gaslight, as it played on the polished shoes, passed beneath them. There was light beneath Matthias's feet, and his feet were resting motionless on empty air. But he was singing in a terrible voice that made the graduated glasses on the counter, the Roman balance with its heavy copper pans, the thousand motionless objects tremble. It was not until I was at the far end of the hall, close to the dining room, that I found a voice to bellow out my horror. Matthias is dead. He's hanging in the shop. From behind the door, I heard the silvery tinkle of a fork dropped to the floor, then the clamorous sound of an overturned chair. It was only after a full minute of awful silence that the voices came. Meanwhile, I was frenziedly repeating, hanging in the shop, hanging in the shop. I was on the point of adding, and he's still singing, when the double doors of the dining room burst noisily open, and the assembled company came rushing pell-mell into the hall. Somebody dragged me after them. I think it was cousin Filarete. I never saw Matthias again, for the Cremelin sisters stood shoulder to shoulder on the threshold of the shop, blocking off my view. Over the heads of Uncle Didaloo and Aunt Sylvie, I saw in the distance the bare arms of my sister raised in the final gesture of someone drowning. I could hear my uncle stammering, "No, no, because I tell you, no." Then came the voice of Dr. Sambucus. piercing as the blade of a knife. But no, Crook hasn't been hanged. His head been nailed to the wall. His head's been nailed to the wall, I repeated stupidly. At this point, I find myself hard to put to set my memories in right order. My mind turns to the words of Lampertuis, strange powers that impose on one by turns forgetfulness and memory. In this way, it seems to me that sometimes the inhabitants of Malpertuis appear to act in full knowledge of what happens, and that for them there is no mystery, and that on other days there are no more than miserable wretches shuddering in terror before the unknown fate that lies in store. There are times when I feel that all that is required is an effort on my part in order to understand, but that a wary fatalism prevents me from gathering the resolve to do so. For the moment, my mind a blank, I abandoned myself to the tide that thrust me, with the howling and gesticulating shadows, into the dining room. But before I find myself there, a fleeting vision passed before my eyes. Beside the bust of the boundary god, close by a lamp that gave off long, star-pointed rays of light, stood Lampertuis, his hands on Nancy's shoulders, and I believe I heard him murmuring, "O goddess." He too has been unable to hold on to the colors and the light. I cannot say how it was that Isengott suddenly appeared among us. He stood before the inhabitants of Malpertuis like a judge at the solemn moment of pronouncing sentence. He said, "Let's have no more of these complaints and all this idle talk." And then, "Nobody must know what happens in Malpertuis. They cannot know." He interspersed these words with silences, as if he were replying to an inaudible questions. Cousin Filarete stepped forward. "Isengott," he said, "I shall do what has to be done." He went out and followed Dr. Sambucus, whose slight stature seemed to have grown greater. Their footsteps were directed toward the paint supplier's shop and were soon out of earshot. "And you, all of you, take up your lives again, as Kassav intended," Isengott concluded. His beard was white as driven snow, and his eyes shone like gemstones. Only Elodie spoke. "I shall pray," she said. Isengott did not so much as glance at her, although the words were addressed to him. And in fact, life resumed its course, as if a thick brushstroke of tar had blotted out the events of that atrocious evening. The very next day, Nancy returned to her place in the shop. There alone at her post, under the russet light of the gas lamp, she served the ever rarer customers. I never saw her shed a tear, nor did I hear her utter a word of complaint. I may have been the only one who gave any further thought to that evening, vague and troubled though this thought may have been. I tried to recall how Uriel had behaved during those tragic moments, and I was forced to the bewildering conclusion that she had not followed the others in their horrified stampede into the bloody shop, that she had remained motionless in her chair, her eyes fixed on her plate, in an attitude of indifference or complete mental absence. The formidable will of Malpertuis, had manifested itself to its prisoners, and they, without more ado, had bowed their heads. So it came about that a hand the size of a fly lay severed in a corner of the attic, and that Matthias Crook, dead with his head nailed to the wall, had, in a spine-chilling voice, sung the Song of Songs. The house on the Quai de la Balaise. The house on the Quai de la Balaise. Who is it then that moves about, that keeps watch and lies in wait in this house? Poritsky, the Gespin. I can't pronounce that. Too German. All right. The Gespenster Gestichen. Okay. I cannot claim that the peaks of terror followed each other in Malpertuis with inexorable succession, or acquired, as in the fatal house of Atreides, a hideous regularity, that of the tides or the phases of the moon. Basing myself on the splendid studies of Monsieur Fresnel, I should be inclined to invoke the phenomena of interference to explain the ebb and flow that characterize the unfolding of the evil forces in Malpertuis. This produces a sort of undulatory phenomenon in which the intensity of those forces varies over time. The Abbé Dustam, who shows an increasingly marked aversion towards such subjects of conversation, was nonetheless happy enough to tell me about a kind of fold in space to explain the juxtaposition of two worlds, different in essence, between which Malpertuis might be considered an abominable point of contact. However, this is merely an image, and the Abbé Dustam holds with a somber satisfaction that I would need an extensive knowledge of mathematics to form a clear idea of what was involved. In this way, without remorse, he leaves me in the dark, for I never was and never will be up to much as a scholar. There are periods of intermission in misfortune and abomination during which the spirit of darkness collects his thoughts or forgets us, during which he leaves us to enjoy peace and quiet. Cousin Filarete is becoming a good chess player and astonishes his teacher, Dr. Sambucus, who groans with his nose glued to the board. Filarete, my lad, either you're a sly customer who's dug out a good chess manual, or else you're a rascal with luck on his side. The taxidermist stirs uneasily in his chair, sipping at a glass of milk, and Sambucus continues. That combination of a knight and a castle following on the sacrifice of a supporting pawn. Ah, my boy, that was a good move. You've got me there. Aunt Sylvie has embroidered some complicated design, and Eleanor Cormelin compliments her unreservedly. It's positively antique work, madame. Rosalie cannot refrain from adding her contribution. It's like a beautiful cat asleep. Uriel gave me the pattern, Aunt Sylvie explains. My cousin deigns to enlighten them. It's the lion of the Jebel. Alice gives her a smile that is not without its particular charm. You draw very nicely, Mademoiselle Uriel. I see you're doing a portrait now. Who is it, I wonder? Uriel says it's the head of Princess Nefertiti. That's Egyptian art, I interject. Thank you for telling us. Uriel replies with an irony I find hurtful. I shoot her a dark look which she disdains to notice. I am close to loving her with all my being or detesting her with all my strength. Ever since the first evening when her hand had lain on my neck and an astonishing promise had fallen from her lips, she has affected to ignore my existence. Time and again, and each time more timidly, I propose a meeting in the garden or in the library. Sometimes she responds with a point blank refusal. On other occasions, she turns her back on me without opening her lips. Her clothes at such times seem to me those of an old woman, her hair a trifle beyond the help of a comb, her face stony, and she is repellent, repellent. One day I said to her, you know, Uriel, tomorrow I shall be 20. You're almost ready to leave the cradle, was her reply. I've promised myself to get revenge for that insult, without, however, being at all clear as to how I might do so. And yet, I have an idea, though it is vague and confused and makes me blush and tremble. Nancy's way of life has in no way changed. She seems to me paler, and her eyes are circled in blue shadow. She is none the less beautiful for that, and when by chance her dress brushes against Uncle Diddaloo, he visibly quivers. Outside it has stopped raining, but autumn, stripping the sky bare of clouds, has unleashed a fierce, dry east wind that presages the approach of winter. The garden no longer has about it a hostile aspect, and I've resolved to spend a few hours there when the sun, still relatively warm, takes possession. But the project regularly comes to naught. I barely get as far as the edge of the pond. Once there, the cold seizes me. I shiver. I draw about my throat the silk scarf without which Elodie forbids me to go out, and I return to the house. On these occasions, I tell myself I will return the next day, and I do not return. Why? I have a feeling that the reason is outside of me. Something, some force, no doubt, considers that what I must see there still does not belong in time, and I am returned to the dismal hours of the daily round. After meals, we remain a long time together in the dining room, and sometimes in the little circular drawing room, which is banal but familiar and cheered by a splendid open fire. The easy chairs there are spacious and deep, the carpet thick and soft, and one of the cupboards is an ample stock of liqueurs, which the men appreciate. There we are in the drawing room. Even Nancy is with us. She has agreed to replace Uncle Diddaloo in his whist game with the Cormellan sisters. Nancy plays badly. Alice is scarcely any better, and her sisters are getting annoyed. Suddenly, Rosalie bursts out. The way you're playing, it's childish. One would never have thought you'll very soon be 35, Electa. Alice starts, and I see in her somber eyes a flash of fear and rage. Perhaps she is not inclined to hear her age revealed. Perhaps, it seems as if the eldest too does not take kindly to the younger one's words. She lays her hand on Rosalie's arm, who still looks pained. Why had she called her Electa? The name is not that different from Alice, but I have the impression that that is the cause of Eleanor Cormellan's displeasure. Sambucus also noticed it. He has looked up, and the expression on his wrinkled face is most enigmatic. It is beyond me. One's life must be pretty dull for one to pay attention to such trivial things. In my heart of hearts, and despite my grudge, I have eyes only for Uriel, who, bent over her sketchbook, pencil in hand, is drawing. But suddenly my whole being tenses. Though not even granting me a look, the scheming creature has been watching me in the mirror, and the portrait she is drawing, deliberately distorted and ugly, is mine. Sad at heart, I leave the room, followed only by Alice's smile. I wander about the deserted house where some lamps are already lit. For many days now, the lamps have not been extinguished, and Lampertuis no longer prowls the haunted corridors, a pitiful soul in torment. He even puts in an appearance in the kitchen, where he consents to sample Elodie's waffles and pancakes. I return to an occupation that for some little time has provided me with a wholly innocent pleasure. I spy on the Graboynes. It is a poor pastime and one that affords few discoveries. By way of a little leaded window whose curtain is only half drawn, I am able to observe them without being seen. Their concierge's lodge, which serves also as a kitchen, is very cramped and the gloomiest room in the house. Pallid light seeps in from a transom window, casting grotesque shadows from the least of objects. When their services are not required about the house, the Graboynes sit at a deal table covered with red plush cloth. Wearing a droopy tasseled nightcap, Graboyne smokes a long brown pipe. His wife, her hands laid flat on her knees, is lost in reverie, her eyes fixed unseeing on the figures in the large image d'Epinal on the wall facing her. Only very rarely do they speak a word to one another. To tell the truth, there is really nothing worth seeing in that double immobility. And yet I spend a considerable time at that curtained window, watching them. And I try to understand what goes on in the minds of those two creatures, happy in their inertia and their silence. All the same, there are moments when the Graboynes shake off the leaden weight that bears down upon them. The wife would vanish into a corner where she would be lost in the shadows. When she reappeared, she would be carrying a brown leather bag. Then Graboyne would lay down his pipe and pass a pointed tongue over his black lips. They were going to count their money. They count and count. Their faces change. Now they are a pair of huge, sharp-clawed rats, piling up heaps of écus and Jeannette. Their parched lips move, and in their movement I read the mounting total, interspersed with an inaudible watchword. We must save up. We must save up. The gold and silver coins do not chink, and when the Graboyne woman rakes them together with a spidery gesture to return them to the leather purse, they make no sound. The woman disappears again into the darkness. Then she resumes her place at the table, her hands on her knees, and Graboyne relights his pipe with a smoky lump of charcoal from the stove, whose filthy stench seems to reach me through the glass of my observation post. Then I get the idea of giving them a fright. Without knowing why, I suddenly cry out, "To cheek!" An earthquake would not have been more disturbing to the old people, intoxicated with money and solitude. To make myself understood, I must go back a little in my account. At Malpertuis, there are never any visitors other than those I have mentioned, with the exception of a creature so ludicrous that the majority of the inhabitants are still unaware of him. Once a week, the Graboyne woman sets about a thorough cleaning of the enormous house, and, thanks to the aid of their helper, everything there shines and glitters within a matter of hours. Dressed in a coarse homespun coat, wearing a sort of tricorn hat that seems screwed down on his enormous round head, this drudge has the appearance of a hogshead mounted on thick legs with feet like cooking pots, arms of a simian length, complete this rough sketch of the human form. He lifts huge wooden buckets filled with water and plies fantastic brooms and floor cloths the size of coverlets with an indescribable vigor. The heaviest objects seem to slide along or rise up themselves at his approach. Despite his bulk, he moves and works at an extraordinary pace. When he cuts the stacks of firewood into little logs, his axe dances in the air, and the chips whiz about him like hailstones in a hailstorm. I had taken care not to question the Graboynes concerning him. One does not ask such questions in Malpertuis. That is the rule one adheres to there, immediately and of one's own accord. One day I resolved to see his face, and my resolve cost me a shock of utter disgust. He had no face. In the shadow of the tricorn, there was only a broad expanse of pink and gleaming flesh, with three small openings at the places of the eyes and the mouth. The Graboyne woman directed his operations by gestures and never spoke a word to him. He, for his part, emitted at rare intervals a single brief sound like the beak clacking of a twilight night jar. To cheek, to cheek. Where did he come from? Where did he go? His duty done. Once, only once, I saw the Graboyne woman lead him into the garden and vanish with him under the trees. One day, then, when the couple, having satisfied their miserly joys, had resumed their dejected attitude, I uttered the cry to cheek, and believe me, I imitated it very well. Graboyne dropped his pipe, and his wife threw her arms in the air, letting out a wild, hooting cry. They rushed to the door together, shooting the bolts and shoving the table and chairs against it as a barricade. From somewhere in the obscurity of the lodge, Graboyne unearthed the cutlass, and I heard him screaming angrily, "You, it's you. Who else but you?" "Impossible, I tell you, completely impossible," she wailed, her face drawn and haggard. I thought it best not to repeat this most successful prank, fearing I know not what discovery, but I knew that Malpertuis concealed yet another mystery. One morning in the week of my 20th birthday, I went down into the kitchen at the hour when Elodie was stoking up her stoves for the midday meal. Dr. Sambucus was keeping her company, drinking a little glass of Spanish wine and nibbling biscuits. "Elodie," I said, "give me the key to our house." "The key to our house?" our servant asked, astonished. "But yes, our house on the Quai Belize. Quai de la Belize. Quai de la Belize. I want to go there after dinner." It was the first time since our coming to Malpertuis that I had made up my mind to escape from it for a few hours. Elodie hesitated. In her honest look, I read fear and reprobation. Sambucus was singing quietly to himself, "When the young bird sprouts its wings." Elodie blushed and said very quietly, "You ought to be ashamed." "But no," the doctor protested. "On the contrary, if the Emperor of Cathay lived amid the admiration, the respect, and love of his subjects, it was because at the age of 10 he had already maintained 700 wives." I held him in my arms when he was so little, and to think, Elodie turned aside and I heard her choke on a sob. "Give him the key all the same, Elodie." With a heavy sigh, she went and fumbled in the drawer of a deep dresser. Without another word, she handed me the key I had asked for. With a strange and delicious anguish in my heart, I slipped away in the darkness of the staircase. I heard the rustling of a dress, but I saw no one. At dinner, I scarcely touched the dishes set before me, and I was mocked by Cousin Filarete, who did full justice to hearty grilled steaks and no less lavish helpings of fowl. I kept a covert watch on the others, as if my least gesture would betray my plan of a magnificent escape. As always, they were indifferent to anything that did not garnish their plates. Uncle continued to sneak glances at Nancy, whose thoughts were elsewhere. Sam Buckus was drawing Filarette's attention to the finer points of the menu. The Carmelin sisters, with the exception of the inwardly smiling Alice, were eating as if they were in a rush. Aunt Sylvie was mopping her plate with an enormous hunk of bread. Uriah was absorbed in staring at the glittering reflections in her glass. The Graboynes were gliding about from one to the other like puppets mounted on castors. When the moment came to cross the threshold into the street, the fear seized me that some mysterious event might intervene that would prevent me from putting my plan into action. I glanced fearfully about me, but nothing moved in the eternal darkness of the place. Only in the distance the boundary god stared at me with his eyes of white stone. The street received me with a broad smile. In a sidelong ray of sunshine, sparrows were bickering over a wisp of straw. In the distance, a fishmonger's rattle was whirring. All at once, faces loomed out of the golden afternoon. They belonged to ordinary people attending to ordinary tasks. They did not so much as glance at me, but I would happily have planted kisses on all those unknown cheeks. On a humped-backed bridge, whose narrow span vaulted the green waters of the river, an old man was dangling his line in the stream. It may be cold, but I've caught a couple of bream, he called out as I passed by. Outside the window of a baker's shop, a flour-covered pastry cook's apprentice poured out a basketful of steaming, newly baked rolls, and in the window of a tavern a couple of pipe smokers gravely clinked their blue stoneware pots, bringing with fresh foam. All these simple images breathed forth life in abundance. I inhaled the chilly air of the street that seemed perfumed with the hot rolls and the frothy beer and enlivened by the song of the river and the light of the old bream fisher. At the corner of the Quai de la Quai de la Balize, our old house came in sight, its green shutters closed. The key was a little difficult to turn in the lock, and the door creaked on its hinges as it opened. This was all the blame that sweet and quiet dwelling laid against me for a long abandonment. I saluted Nicholas Grandsire, tall and severe in his folded gold frame, and hastened to the drawing room, witness to so many tranquil hours. A vague odor of fustiness and vetiver hung in the air, but the logs in the hearth were ready for kindling. At the first flame, the house awoke and was welcoming. The broad divan, on which Nancy had heaped up an improbable quantity of cushions, invited me to rest. Books forsaken, but for all that never forgotten, lit up the prism of their multicolored bindings behind the glass doors of the bookcase. Knickknacks flirtatiously sought to make me forget that a little dust had dimmed their beauty. Pink conch shells began once more to imitate the sound of the sea at my approach. Countless small tokens of affection melted into one to welcome me and keep me among them. In a corner of the mantelpiece, I came upon the Abbé Douce-Dame's cherry wood pipe and his glazed earthenware tobacco jar. I was apprehensive of the harsh joys of the fragrant weed, but a fond recollection of my excellent teacher caused me to fill the pipe and light it. I am still amazed at the triumphal entry I made into the paradise of smokers. My being experienced no revulsion, and from the first puffs my delight was absolute. It was the triple pleasure of my temporarily regained liberty, of my rediscovered surroundings, and my solitary initiation into tobacco that caused me to forget that I was expecting. I was expecting I knew not what, but I had left Malpertuis in the certainty of that expectation. And I spoke that certainty aloud. I'm expecting. I'm expecting. I took as witness the objects surrounding me. I asked the knickknacks dressed in light dust, the roar of the conch shells, the delicate curls of blue smoke for an answer. I'm expecting. I'm expecting. Suddenly the response came. A high-pitched bell sounded timidly in the hallway. My heart contracted, and, for some moments, fear held me captive on the divan, amid the warm delight of the cushions. The bell renewed its call more insistently. I had the impression that a very long interval elapsed between the moment of my rising from the divan and the moment when, passing the portrait of Nicholas' grandsire in the hall, I opened the door. A veiled silhouette stood there in the golden mildness of the afternoon. She entered without a sound, slipped like a shadow through the hall to the drawing room and the divan. The veils fell. I recognized the smile. Strong hands grasped me by the shoulders, drawing me down, while burning lips took possession of mine. Alice Cormelin had come. I knew now that it was her I was expecting, that it could only have been her. The flaming logs exhaled a torrid scent of burning resin. The tobacco smoke had a fragrance of spices and honey, and from Alice's veils and her clothes, as they fell with muffled sound to the deeply carpeted floor, there arose the heavy redolence of rose and amber. Twilight was insinuating itself over the slopes of the darkening roofs, the fire crumbling into cinders in the mirror, becoming swamped with black waters, when Alice nodded up her long ebony and jet hair. Time to go, she murmured in a whisper. We'll stay here, I said, crushing her to me fiercely. Without any effort, she disengaged herself from my feeble embraces. Beneath the marvelous ivory tint of her arms, she was in full control of her powerful muscles. Shall we come back then? It was already too dark for me to read anything in her eyes. Perhaps, she sighed. Her dress rose about the forms that had uncovered their adorable mystery, and the veils were back in place. Suddenly, she grasped me in her arms, shuddering with terror. Listen, there's somebody walking about in the house. I listened and shuddered in turn. A slow and heavy tread was advancing, leaving a hollow vacancy in the silence. I could not have said whether it was descending from the floor above or coming up from the cellars. Its sound filled the void, and yet it awoke no sonority or resonance. It advanced across the hall and halted abruptly at the door of the drawing room, where Alice and myself stood motionless, frozen in terror. At any moment, I expected to see that door turn slowly on its hinges and open onto the mystery of that sound. It did not open, but in the evening gloom a voice spoke slow and doleful, Alecta, Alecta, Alecta. 3 separate blows were struck on the door, and 3 times my heart leapt in my breast, as if those blows had been struck at the depth of my being. Alice reeled on her feet, stiffened, and precipitately opened the door. The hall was empty. The green light from the window flooded it like a forgotten reflection of the moon. Come, she said. We found ourselves in the street at the gentle hour when the lamps are lit. Alecta, I said. She let out a fierce cry and seized my shoulder in a bone-cracking grip. Never, you understand, never, never speak that name unless you wish misfortune and terror to come upon you. At the corner by the bridge, she left me without a word of farewell, and I have no idea what route she took to return to Malpertuis, for she was there on my return, and I had not dallied on the way. Elodie took the key from me without asking any questions. I sat down by the fire where the braised steaks were gently dribbling in the casseroles. Elodie, I've brought back the Abbe Dustam's pipe and his jar of tobacco. I think I'm going to enjoy smoking very much. Dr. Sambucus, who had just come in and who had heard, backed me up. It does me good to hear that, my lad, knowing you smoke a pipe. It seems to me there's another man under the roof of Malpertuis, and God knows we have few enough. Elodie uttered not a word. It was plain she was in a bad mood. I left the kitchen, followed by Sambucus. On the landing, the doctor took my arm. Listen, he said. In the distance, there arose the sound of lamentation. It's Lampernice. He started again. The lamps are going out again. And away he went with his quick tripping, bird-like walk. In the hallway, I ran into Nancy. She drew me into the corner where the boundary god held sway and regarded me earnestly in the light of the clay lamp that burned there. Oh, Gigi, what's going on? What's happened to you? You're completely different. It's only a few hours ago that you left me. You are suddenly like your father's portrait. She set her lips against my hair, but immediately backed away with a cry of grief. You smell of rose and amber. Oh, my Gigi. She fled into the darkness, and I heard her weeping bitterly. I was standing there motionless, leaning against the stone god's pedestal, when a voice of a heart-rending sadness arose in the darkness. The goddess is weeping. They have stolen the light from her eyes and her heart. The evening came to a close. In the round drawing room, chest, whist, and embroidery, whist, and chess. Alice played well and was complimented. She blushed with pleasure. Uriel lost, let fall the pencil she had been toying with, and took a turn about the great table. When she arrived behind Alice, she halted and appeared interested in her hand of cards. I saw at once, though, that it was not upon the variegated pieces of cardboard that Uriel's gaze was fastened, but on Alice's neck, that white, rather long, infinitely gracious neck, from which I had with such difficulty detached my lips. Uriel's body was vibrating with a cruel vitality. Her hands rose, reaching to the level of that neck. Alice was still smiling, her thoughts elsewhere, unaware of my cousin's mute rage. I felt no fear. A sense of pride, triumph blazed out in my heart. She's jealous. Uriel is jealous. I did not ask myself if she was aware of my amorous escapade. I could only rejoice inwardly. She's jealous. For a brief moment, I could have wished to see her ferocious talons clamped about the young woman's throat. But nothing so final occurred. Uriel's hands dropped and were lost in the folds of her black dress. She continued her round of the table and insinuated herself beside me. I kept my eyes fixed on the pier glass facing me. For lack of illumination, it was completely dark. Suddenly, two dreadful points of light pierced its gloom, and I saw again for the second time the terrible tiger eyes that fixed me. But this time, instead of streaming opalescent gleams, they were burning with an indescribable fury. I did not turn my head. Ex diddaloo, exit diddaloo, exit Nancy, exit to cheek. There are crimes which God alone can avenge. The Book of Enoch. For the third time now on the staircase, I had slipped a note into Alice's hand, in which I had asked for a second rendezvous in the house on the Quai de la Balise. Hide your reply under the bust of the boundary god, I had begged by way of conclusion. The boundary god and Cupid, prince of love affairs, have nothing in common. At the third pressing and miserable appeal, a square of paper bears a brief, indeed monosyllabic reply. No. All my cunning moves to bring about an encounter with the youngest of the Cormellan sisters have come to nothing. I lie in wait for Alice as for a prey, and she escapes my ambushes with an adroitness that is tinged with malice, until such time as chance enlightens me as to the reason for her refusal and succeeds in breaking my heart. It was one of those featureless days when nothing occurs to trouble the strange sleep of Malpertuis, when all the mystery and terror that the house encompasses is absent, or subject to the mysterious law of intermission. In the yellow drawing room, which we rarely enter, so hostile is it to our presence, Uncle Diddaloo was writing furiously. The door was half ajar, and I saw him bent over his work, brow moist, eyes fevered. At length, with a nervous gesture, he blotted the sheet he had written, sealed it in an envelope, and hurriedly left the room. I slipped in after him and took possession of the blotting paper. Uncle Diddaloo's writing was large and clear, and it was traced with a broad cut quill pen, so that the blotting paper reproduced it faithfully in reverse. It was a small step to hold up the sheet to the revelation of a mirror. Ah, my heart, my poor 20-year-old heart. My beloved Alice, I must see you again, but our meetings here in Malpertuis itself are becoming more and more risky. Try as I might to convince myself that nobody sees us, I feel that attentive and dangerous eyes are fixed upon us from the deepest shadows. We must escape for a few hours from this house of peril. I have been looking for a roof to give an obliging shelter to our moments of tenderness, and at last have found one. Hold on to this address, 7 Rue de la Tête Perdue. It is an alleyway which most people do not know is there, starting from the far side of the Place de Ormes, and running into the Prix aux Ois. At number 7 lives La Mère Grouille, an old woman, half deaf and blind, who is very fond of money, but is not so deaf as to fail to hear the 3 rings at the bell, which will induce her to open the door even late at night. She will open the door to let you then, even if you ring at midnight, and will not recognize you, nor even look at you. You climb the stairs before you. 2 doors open off the landing. The room, our room, is the one that looks out over the little garden. It cannot but please you. In the days of her one-time glory, La Mère Grouille must have been a person of taste. I shall be waiting for you this evening at midnight. It is not very difficult to leave Malpertuis, where everybody is in bed by 10, provided they don't insist on a game of whist. This is a request. Don't oblige me, my beloved Alice, to turn it into a command. In that case, I shall call you Alecta, your own Charles. I let fall the blotting paper, the betrayer of such crime, and ran to the garden to hide my tears of rage and shame. It was only when the last of these were drying in the harsh northerly wind that was shaking the trees that I recalled the last sentence of the letter and its threat. In that case, I shall call you Alecta. Why did that name, so close to the name Alice, fill the fearful eyes of Eleanor Cormelin with wrath? What mysterious voice had pronounced that name in the twilight of her house on the Quai de la Balise? And why had Alice cried out in fear to such a degree as to threaten me? The heart's sorrows are not exempt from a certain bitter pleasure. I understood this when I returned to the yellow drawing room to retrieve the blotting paper and reread the words that had so wounded me. It was no longer there. I did not give the matter much thought, assuming that Uncle Diddaloo, realizing his lack of prudence, had recovered it. I saw Alice again at dinner. A slight flush about her cheeks, an excited light in her eyes told me the letter had reached its destination. Uncle Diddaloo's cock-a-hoop manner left me in no doubt as to the response. Alice had accepted the midnight assassination. Perhaps everything would have come to an end for me in an outburst of tears, some resentment, and then healthy forgetfulness, had not Diddaloo, intoxicated with his victory, poked fun at my youth. Dr. Sambucus, in the mood for philosophical discussion, launched into a discourse on the eternal verities, invoking Cicero's De Senectute. Diddaloo registered his agreement and went one better. To think, he remonstrated, that teachers put a work such as that into the hands of snotty-nosed whippersnappers like our friend Jean-Jacques. Ah, that's what you might call casting pearls before swine. I blushed with fury, which seemed to please him mightily. Don't fret yourself, little lad, he concluded, in a mawkish and patronizing tone. You still have your humming tops and glass marbles. I gritted my teeth and brusquely left the dining room, from which I heard a burst of laughter. Scum, I grumbled sullenly. We'll see soon enough what sort of face you'll pull when. Once again, my plan was vague and ill-defined, and it did not become any clearer until supper time, when once again I saw Alice. Jealousy racked my inmost being. Rancor inflamed me like a traitorous swine. That was what clinched the matter. An officer of the night watch, bearing a halberd, was crying 11:30 at the corner of Rue de Voie Chantier, as I silently shut the door behind me. Uncle Diddaloo had rightly predicted bedtime in Malpertuis from 10 o'clock onward. Everything there became quiet and somber and lightless, apart from the eternal lamps that bestarred the corridors, and which no spirit of darkness came to menace. Some festival or other was still enlivening the town, for behind the red lit windows of the taverns, songs and bursts of laughter could be heard, and from time to time I encountered drunken revelers speaking their thoughts aloud to the moon. Here and there at the remote corners of deserted streets, the dying lights of a few Chinese lanterns still glimmered. To reach the Place de Ormies, I had to cross a street of doubtful reputation, lined with disreputable drinking houses. On the threshold of one of these, a group of masked feasters importuned me. Hey, you handsome boy, come and stand us a drink. I continued on my way without looking back, pursued by jibes and coarse jests. The street petered out in darkness, the pavement skirting a row of forbidding houses, lit by a hanging lantern. In its light was a night owl standing quite motionless, his eyes raised to the sky. He was draped in a black, hooded cloak, and as I drew closer, I saw that he too was a participant in the expiring festivities, for a mask covered his face. But what a mask! I remember that when I was a child, a Lodi had cut out one of my picture books a print of the devil painting masks. The evil one was bent over a covered visage, which he was transforming with rapid brushstrokes into a nameless horror. A brief glimpse of that image had thrown me into convulsions, and a Lodi had removed it once and for all from my horrified attention. Now the mask, raised to the stars, evoked that print so vividly that I leapt to one side. The solitary figure made no move. He did not seem to notice my presence or my terror. He passed against the wall with his head raised and the light of the lantern falling on the appalling grimace of his mask. I passed him hurriedly. I turned when I reached the corner. He had vanished. I found myself on the Place de Ormies. Here, the houses were further apart, leaving space for a few trees and broadening out an expanse of sky, in which a crescent moon was rising. A shadow momentarily effaced the sickle moon as it passed across it, and yet not a cloud troubled the purity of that icy sky. The shadow passed over the trees, then over the houses. In front of me, something fell to the earth with a soft, muffled sound. I saw a small dead owl, its silvery belly stained with blood. I rang 3 times at number 7 on La Rue de la Tête Perdue. An old woman opened the door, clenched her hand over the coins I held out to her, and immediately turned her back on me. A staircase lit by a Venetian glass lamp led in narrow flights to the upper story. Somewhere on the ground floor, the old woman began talking out loud, confiding her strange utterances to a cat. Leaning over the banister rail, I could see her huddled in an enormous plush chair, the cat, which she called Lupka, in her lap. I realized that for years now she had been all but blind, and that she lived in a permanent semi-sleep that rendered her actual complete sleep useless to her. When the bell rang, she knew from the shutter that ran along Lupka's bath that she must receive visitors and their money. Ah, yes, they were strange things that she intoned. The gods are getting a new taste for life, Lupka, but it is the detestable life of men that falls to their lot. It's splendid, though, splendid, and it gladdens me. Listen, you don't like me saying it, nor him either, eh? I don't care, for that's the wretched part I had to play. 3 times the velvety water has flowed over your skin, Lupka, she sang softly. I opened the door and he put a gold coin in my hand. Gold is warm and it warms my heart through my calloused flesh. Silver is colder and its sweetness does not mount so high in my veins. What sort of man is it that my eyes refuse to see? Tell me then, Lupka, whose shudders are a language? Well, well, I know now, a slug sticking to the wheel of fortune over which the divine foot is poised. I accepted the warm gold as one accepts love, and the hand that brushed against mine was not quite that of a man. Not that I care. Who is it, though, that would oppose the workings of fate? Who is he? Where is he? What is he doing? What does it matter to me? That's what I say. But since the breath that animates the marvelous force of your fur is so very talkative tonight, I cannot but listen, a flame fluttering in the wind of pain and fear. What are you saying? In the other room, attentive to everything that's happening and will happen in the next room. Ah, Lupka, There was a time when that meant nothing else but youth. Be quiet. Be quiet. I forbid you to look, Lupka. That one hasn't rung 3 times on the bell of love. No need for that. She hasn't given me gold, for I wasn't obliged to open the door to her. Be quiet. Be quiet. Your whole being is crackling with sparks, and you are a demon. You render a terrified homage. Ah, 3 bells, 3 rings of the bell. I must open the door. The rest belongs to the night. And thus on the borderlands of dream, La Mère Gruy soliloquized. Sounds rose up the stairwell. I left my observation post, feeling no more interest in those empty words. And repressing the nausea that rose to my lips at such a downfall, I reached the room, looking out over the little garden. The door was open and it was still empty. My heart contracted as I admitted to myself that blackguard Diddaloo had neither lied nor exaggerated when he had promised Alice a worthy love nest. I still wonder how it came about that mean and dingy house, where the air stagnated, heavy with the stale odor of fustiness, could, under its moss grown roof, shelter such a marvel of warm tenderness. Veiled in shades of transparent silk, candles were burning, set in mother of pearl candlesticks. A fire of small, crackling logs was dancing in the depths of a fireplace of the finest marble. It took some time to make out the precise forms of the furniture. Everything there was white, mauve, and soft in outline, as if at the heart of a huge snowball. An obstinate scent of tuberose floated in the mild air, and on a silver bracket an hourglass counted the moments by the crystalline fall of its tears. I stood there a while bewitched, before it came to me that in those dreamlike surroundings my first love was dying away. But the bitter sentiment of jealousy was soon replaced by another. A nameless terror reigned in that atmosphere of abandon. I felt none the less that I remained a stranger to that incommensurable anguish, and that it was outside of me, that whilst brushing against me, it was pursuing some other end. I was seized by a violent desire to warn Alice and Uncle Diddaloo of the peril I foresaw, but a will opposed to my own was already usurping my actions. I backed out of the room and, like a sleepwalker, found my way to the other. Footsteps were approaching up the staircase. Ah, a cesspool replaced the white and mauve Eden. Through the curtainless windows, an insolent moonlight shamelessly illuminated the sordidness of the place. The door of my retreat was open, and the Venetian glass lamp lit up the landing. The silhouette of Uncle Diddaloo was thrown on the dimly lit, color-streaked wall. He seemed to me ugly and ridiculous, and his great puce hooded overcoat and his rigid little felt hat. As he came up the stairs, he was listening one of the vulgar tunes that had pursued me through the festive streets. I heard him grunting with pleasure when he entered the marvelous room, and the next moment, to my fury, he began in his tremulous voice to sing poor Matthias's Crook's Song of Songs. I am the rose of Sharon. Thy name is as ointment poured forth. Ah, the wretch! To that song, so moving, sanctified by the blood of Matthias, he had added his own words, words so dissolute as to turn my stomach. Perfume disperses, disperses, tiddly tersis, tiddly tarsis, 36 legs make 18. Only the magnitude of the horror prevented me from running to him, flinging my contempt in his face and boxing his ears. For the horror came. An enormous black form silently mounted the stairs, stepped over the banister rail, slipped toward the room where Diddaloo was still bellowing. I recognized the frightful masked figure from the street. It passed my door and was bathed in the moonlight. I saw that what I had taken for a repellent cardboard mask was an unbelievable reality. The hood had fallen back and laid bare the head of the intruder in all its frightfulness. It was huge, chalky white, and pierced with bloodshot, flaming eyeballs. The mouth was immense and black, the lips drawn back in a mirthless grin over a cat-like set of teeth, with overgrown canines licked by a narrow cleft tongue. A black vapor undulated in a monstrous aureole about that hellish muzzle. I saw it rising and falling like boiling pitch, and then suddenly punctured with innumerable eyes, cruel and fixed. Serpents lacquered in darkness were twisting and thrashing about that demoniacal skull. For a few seconds, the monstrosity remained still, as if to give me time to look my fill on its boundless hideousness. Then it threw back its cloak and revealed the membranous wings and claws of gleaming steel. With a howl that set the whole decrepit building shaking, it hurled itself into the room where Diddaloo was singing. I, in my turn, let out a cry of terror, and I tried to rush out of the room. I even think that despite my unutterable fear, I would have sought to go to Uncle Diddaloo's aid. Something held me back. Something was pressing down on my arm, heavy as lead, a hand very large and very beautiful, as if carved in old ivory. It materialized out of the darkness, and I saw only it. Slowly it drew me to the window, and I saw the sky. It was in the grip of an unbelievable tumult. I saw gigantic wings gliding in the moonlight, eyes lit with a violent red fury, monstrous claws grasping at haunted space. In the midst of those forms, tormented by an infernal rage, 90 feet from the ground, a human form was struggling, and I recognized Uncle Diddaloo. I cried out. But a roll of thunder and flashes of lightning drowned that feeble cry of distress. The ivory hand was no longer weighing down on my arm. I saw it still, though, vanishing into the distance like a white flame. But now a silhouette appeared, still very vague in the darkness of the room, a long frock coat, a silvery beard, eyes that were severe and at the same time infinitely sad. Isengard! There was no longer anyone there to reply. The phantom had vanished. Sobbing, I rushed out of the detestable hovel. The storm had ceased abruptly. The sky was pure, given over to the diamond-strewn splendor of the stars and the soft light of the moon. I ran to the Place d'Ormes, and in the distance I saw stretched out the body of Uncle Diddaloo. But I did not approach it. A thick-set figure emerged from the shadow of the trees. I recognized Cousin Filaretti. He walked over to the corpse, lifted it without emotion, and carried it off into the night. And nobody ever spoke of Uncle Diddaloo again. Not once. Under the domain of what mysterious force do we live, no longer to concern ourselves with him, as if he had never been one of us, as if he had never existed? Henceforth at meals Aunt Sylvie sat next to Rosalie Cormelin, one time table companion of my uncle, and it seemed to be the most natural thing in the world for her. As soon as we found ourselves alone in the kitchen, I mentioned the name of the departed Elodie. She was staring into the fire. Without raising her eyes, she said, "We must pray. In this life, we must always pray." It was toward Christmas that my sister Nancy left us. She did so in the most straightforward of ways. One morning, as we were drinking coffee in the kitchen, Elodie, Dr. Sambucus, and myself, she came in, dressed in an ample broadcloth coat and carrying a traveling bag. "I'm leaving you," she said. "I'm giving up all the assets that were promised to me. God willing, I shall keep watch over Gigi from afar." "God go with you," Elodie murmured, without evincing the least surprise. "Adieu, my beauty," said Sambucus, biting without further ado into a thin slice of buttered bread. I caught up with her on the stairs and took hold of the hem of her coat, but she pushed me away gently. "My destiny is not to remain in Malpertuis, and I am sure it isn't yours, Gigi," she said gravely. "You'll be going back to our house on the Quai de la Balize, Nancy." She shook her splendid head, somber head. "Oh, no, no." She left without a backward glance, and the street door fell to behind her with a final thunderous crash. I made my way to the paint suppliers. It was empty. Carboys, glass jars, balances, packing cases, and bottles, all were gone. In a corner, I heard a sound like the nibbling of mice, and there I found Lampertuis finishing off his bowl of gruel. I told him of Nancy's departure, but he seemed not to hear me, and appeared to be taking a certain pleasure in his wretched repast. And then, amid the seasonal ice and snow, Christmas came. Well, guys, We're up to 3 o'clock here, and we're about halfway through this incredible book. And I think we're going to take a break and call it here. And we will return tomorrow afternoon and finish this marvelous, wonderful story. How fun has this been? I hope you guys have been enjoying this beautiful, amazing work, Malpertuis by Jean Ray. How fun. How fun. All right, everyone. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Much love, and I hope you've been enjoying this beautiful, beautiful story. And I hope to see you tomorrow when we give it a good finish. And this evening, we're going to be doing a Drawing Down the Dragons episode with my dear friend Graham, where we're going to be diving into Mysteries by Bill Watterson and John Kasht, or Kosht. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but it's going to be a really fun time. So tune in for that. And then after, we're going to be watching the 1972 movie Malpertuis in the Temple of the Muses Discord. So I hope to see you guys there. All right. And with that, everyone, much love. And thank you so much for joining me. And please, if you ever have any book recommendations or thoughts about this incredible book, leave me comments. I always love to hear from you. All right. Peace and love, everyone. And take care. See you later. Peace.